there are too many layers that we can peel back on the text where we can look at this aspect and then look at this aspect and look at this aspect. And no matter what we do to pretty much any way we look at it, other than the thin layer of translation, once we get past the English words and we start dealing with what the text actually does, the way it's constructed, the imageries that it uses, the way it fits in with history, the more we peel those things back, the better the text looks. And frankly, the less possibility there is that anybody in Joseph's times could have created that.
Mormonism with the Murph, where we do a fair and objective analysis of the church and its truth claims, its history, doctrine, and policy. Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel Mormonism with the Murph, where Larry Saint explores the church's history and the church's truth claims, and I'm really excited for today's interview. I have with me scholar Brant Gardner. Brant, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So a little introduction about Brant. So Brant Gardner, he is an American researcher, writer, and speaker of the Book of Mormon and Mesoamerican studies. He received a degree from BYU and also a master's in anthropology. He has done a lot of scholarly and apologetic work on behalf of FAIR, and he's the author of multiple books, including this one, which we're going to promote. It is the Book of Mormon as Historicity, the Tradition of Our Fathers. So Grant, I'm really excited to have you on because I'm doing my own series sort of tackling into the Book of Mormon, into like scholarship and tackling sort of like its historicity and truth claims. So this will be a really exciting discussion. Is there anything you want to say about your background or anything about your work in, scholarship or apologetics?
I guess I can give you just a little bit of a background, and part of it would start with the idea of apologetics. I am always classified as an apologist, and I never self-classify as an apologist.
It's kind of a pejorative term, isn't it? A lot of people don't like being
labeled
as one.
That. It's usually we think of the word apologist as somebody who is dealing with people who are outside of faith, and I'm trying to defend faith to the people outside. And frankly, that's not my interest. I'm certainly more than welcome people who are outside the faith to ask questions. I'm more than happy to give answers if I can. But I'm really more interested in improving the faith of the people who already believe by expanding their understanding of the text. So, my emphasis is not really on defending it to anybody else, although in order to really understand the text, you have to understand some of the criticisms and why those criticisms may or may not apply, and how we understand those relationships. So frankly, it helps to know what critics say about the text. But ultimately, I don't have any hope of convincing a critic.
And that's not your intent, is to defend and try to convince other people, but to... I even felt from reading your book, it seemed more just scholarly and diving into like the scholarship and historicity, and it didn't seem as much about apologetics or just trying to defend the Book of Mormon at all costs, which I appreciated.
Yeah, and I guess that's behind most of what I'm doing, is that I really want to understand the text and explain it, but do so in a scholarly manner, in a way that when someone from outside the faith looks at it, at least they could say, okay, I understand why you believe that. Yeah. So they may not be convinced, but at least they can see there's an argument for it.
Yeah. And something I'm striving to do in my channel is to try to be fair and objective, and to sort of look at the evidence that supports the Book of Mormon, the evidence that faithful scholars or apologists might present, but also to address and look at some of the criticisms or some of the attacks from critics, and like look at sort of the strengths and weaknesses of both. And I think it's important to confront these things, particularly as more and more people might be having issues with regards to the text of the Book of Mormon or its historicity. I want to start off by reading a quote from your book that I absolutely loved, and I want to read it now before I forget. You quoted, it was B.H. Roberts. I'd never heard this quote before, but I really liked it. Um, it says the Book of Mormon of necessity must submit to every test, to literary criticism, as well as to every other class of criticism, for our age is above all things critical, and especially critical of sacred literature. And we may not hope that the Book of Mormon will escape the closest scrutiny. Neither indeed is it desirable that it should escape. It is given to the world as a revelation from God. It is a volume of American scripture. Men have a right to test it by the keenest criticism and to pass the severest judgment upon it. And we who accept it as a revelation from God have every reason to believe that it will endure every test. The more thoroughly it is investigated, the greater shall its triumph be. I just really like that quote because, he's sort of saying that, the Book of Mormon, it will be and almost should be, examined and tested and scrutinized as it claims to be both a revelation from God, but also makes historical claims. And that, the church and its truth claims and the prophet Joseph Smith, they kind of rise and fall with the, authenticity and the historicity of the Book of Mormon. And we shouldn't be fearful as believers of, examining those claims. I kind of like that quote from him.
It's even more interesting in that when B.H. Roberts wrote that, it was very early on in our ability to understand the historicity of the text and how the text would have fit into a real world context. And we have learned so much since then. He would be amazed to know what we have learned since then.
Yeah.
But it's fascinating that at the beginning of the process, when we still didn't know much, when there still were many, many questions that were unanswerable, he had that kind of confidence in the text.
Yeah.
And it's been proven since. And I think that's one of the things that, again, talking to believers, anybody who has a question about the historicity of the text, the very first thing that you have to have is patience. It has been demonstrated over the last 200 years that the longer we wait, the better the text gets. The more it fits into the better contexts we have, the better we understand the text. And so that patience of saying, here's what we know. There's a couple of places where I wish we knew more, but I can be patient because of the great foundation of what we do know.
Right. No, I love that. And the Book of Mormon, it's considered, as Joseph Smith said, to be, the keystone of our religion. And just as, if the keystone of the arch falls, the church falls with it. And it really is sort of the convincing evidence, considered to be the keystone of our testimonies, the convincing evidence of the restoration and the prophet Joseph Smith. And, the church holds it as scripture, another testament of Jesus Christ, that it contains, with the Bible, the fullness of the gospel. But it's also not just divine scripture, but it makes historical truth claims, written by, people living in the Americas, ancient prophets. We have the Nephites and the Lamanites that lived between 600 BC to 420 something AD. You have the Jaredites who came, what was it, 2200 BC, roughly about then, writing sort of on these ancient gold plates that Joseph Smith, claimed to receive from the angel Moroni and translate them by the gift and power of God. So sort of connected to the book's authenticity are these sort of historical claims as well.
Mm-hmm. And frankly, that's what gives the book life. If you don't understand the Book of Mormon as something that was written by real people, I think it diminishes its ability to help us as real people use what it says to be better.
Yeah.
We have to be able to see ourselves in it and understand that that motivations can matter. That when we see why people did things, then we can understand better how to adapt it to the motivations and the problems that we have to deal with.
Yeah, that's awesome. So I thought it'd be good to start with maybe your take on sort of like the translation and coming forth of the Book of Mormon. A lot of faithful, historians and scholars view it as, really miraculous that it was as the Book of Mormon as we have it today was dictated within 85 days, that Joseph Smith translated the 116 pages, either with the Urim and Thummim, but the Book of Mormon as we have it today, according to eyewitness accounts, it was through the seer stone and looking into the stone and dictating the words as they appeared. 531 pages, and we have the testimony of the witnesses of the gold plates. Just give us your thoughts on the coming forth of the Book of Mormon.
And let's just back up and make sure that we underline what you just said, which is my thoughts on the translation, because this is still in Latter-day Saint scholarly circles a discussion that's being had. There is no complete agreement, although I think we're heading in a direction of agreement on sort of the nature of the translation. There are certain things about the translation that we all know, as you said, the time frame we know, the process and the mechanism we know. The couple of things, and I guess the most important thing to know about the translation, and it's one that I think you have to answer before you can ever deal with historicity, is how close the English text that Joseph dictated is related to the Nephite text that was on the gold plates. And
the tight versus loose sort of translation theory.
Yeah, I mean, those are the words that are being used, and there's some problems and issues with those that nobody really needs to get bored with. But that concept of whether or not what we have in English represents precisely what's on the plate, or perhaps approximately which was on the plates, and is there some space in between that?
Yeah, some nuance.
This is a place where I think we are finally getting a little bit more convergence in the ideas, where the scholars are saying, as far as the relationship of the English text to the underlying Nephite text, it isn't a direct one. There are issues that we have in the English text that are very obviously related to English and not to whatever was on the plates. And I've got a quotation here from Royal Skousen that I should pull up, because it's something that I've been talking about for a long time, and I think he and I thought we disagreed, and it turns out that I think we agree more than we disagree. But here's what he said. This is coming from a talk he gave in January 15 of 2020.
Yeah.
Let's see. He called the Book of Mormon a creative and cultural translation of what was on the plates, not a literal one.
Wow.
Okay, let me repeat that. A creative and cultural translation of what was on the plates, not a literal one. And I think that's really important, because it says that we need to understand the Book of Mormon as a translation, rather than the very simplistic way of saying what was there must have been exactly what was on the plates. Because if we do that, then we have some problems that become extremely difficult to get around. We find, for example, the idea of the horse. And I bring up horse for two reasons, one of which is it's always brought up as an anachronism in the Book of Mormon. And one of the fascinating things that's been happening as we, as I said, have patience and wait, they have within the last year actually found and carbon-14 dated horse remains that date to pre-Columbian eras in Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
So there is now archaeological evidence of pre-Columbian horses. Not yet carbon-14 dating to Book of Mormon times, but the fact that it's there prior to the Spaniards is interesting. And of course, there's still some controversy on that, because some people will say that although they were found in the right strata and date that way, that there must be something wrong, because of course everybody knows that there were no horses, and so we have to deal with
I think I heard that it was the surrounding material that was carbon dated to like Book of Mormon times, but they haven't tested the collagen in the bone, so it's not definitive.
There's there's always issues.
Hmm.
But that's frankly beyond the point. I mean, that's one thing where you say, okay, well, yeah, they found horses. But that's not even the problem in the Book of Mormon, because even if you find horses, horses do not play a role in the Book of Mormon. So if you look at the text of the Book of Mormon and you say, what do horses actually do? You find out that they move. You find out that they have to be fed. But other than that, you don't know anything. There's an association with a chariot, whatever, again, that might have been, but we don't know. We just assume that they pull it because that's what we think a horse would do. But there's just no evidence in the text that very clearly tells you what a horse does. And in the place where we know that they move, it's in a list of animals that you would eat. So in every culture of the world that has had horses domesticated, the horse has transformed the culture. Horses just change everything. And there's no evidence that anything like that happens in the Book of Mormon. There's complete absence of that. And if you think about, again, this question of Joseph Smith creating it, Joseph Smith was horse culture. I mean, absolutely.
Yeah.
If he is replicating his own culture into the Book of Mormon, we should have seen horses. They should have affected what was happening. People should have ridden them from place to place, and never happens. We just don't see it in the text.
Okay.
Now, understanding the Book of Mormon as translation literature helps us understand that when we see that in the text, it isn't a problem to say that it's a translation anachronism. For example, in the King James Bible, we have unicorns. What else? Oh, we have other, temporal anachronisms. We all know that we should not hide our candle under a bushel. Well, that's in this translation because they didn't have candles. Candles came later.
Anachronistic.
Yeah, and so yes, there's an anachronism in the King James Bible. There's problems. There's animals that don't exist in the King James Bible. Is that a reason to say that the Bible cannot be true? Absolutely not, because it's translation literature. And,
right. They're translating it into sort of modern, their vocabulary. It was the 17th century when the King James Bible translation came out. So they're putting it in their own language or vocabulary.
The other thing that we know, and this goes back into my background in Mesoamerica. When I first got into Mesoamerican studies, it was before the time that anybody had translated the Maya glyphs. And so if you were going into Mesoamerican studies, you studied the Aztec, not the Maya, because we had texts, we had things we could read.
Right.
And that could help us understand the archaeology and what was happening. The problem is the vast majority of the texts that we had to read were in Spanish and written by Spaniards. And so the question is, how well does what the Spaniards wrote replicate what the natives believed? And it turns out that sometimes the Spaniards kind of elaborated on things and changed them. And so you have to learn how to read between the lines of the text. Right. And in the Book of Mormon, very frequently, that's exactly what we have to do. We have to read between the lines so that we say, what is the culture saying here rather than what is the English language saying?
So you're kind of saying that translation between languages, it's never a word for word translation. There's some phrases in one language that aren't translatable into another language. And my wife's actually from Mexico, so she speaks Spanish. And there's certain phrases that she has in Spanish that there just isn't an equivalent to in English. Now, just going back to the tight versus loose translation, whenever you look at the sort of like statements of the witnesses, like Emma Smith, Martin Harris, David Whitmer, I think Joseph Knight Sr. as well, they do make the translation according to, their eyewitness accounts seem almost more tight or more word for word. Joseph Smith
absolutely
has his face in the hat, and that he's, the spiritual light is shining, and he sees a character and then reading the sentence, and then they can't, move on till it's written down correctly. And it, as you read those statements, it kind of makes it seem like it is a word for word tight translation. and it doesn't
Yes.
allow for sort of errors or anachronisms or
Yeah.
Joseph expanding upon the text. What would be your thoughts? Because some critics might think that apologists are moving towards a loose translation to account for errors or anachronisms or problems in the text. But if you look at the historical sources, they would support a tight translation.
One of the themes that I think is important as we discuss historicity of the Book of Mormon, and kind of an underlying theme, is that things are way more complex than people typically take them to be. So, for example, we have the statements of the witnesses that you just mentioned. And the simple reading of those, to read them and say, here's what they said, therefore it must be true, that's certainly the intent they had, but the reality is more complex. So, for example, they said, here is, Joseph would say something and it had to be correct or else it couldn't go on. And so, we know that it was marvelous translation because God made sure that it was accurate. So Royal Skousen, who's done more work on the text of the Book of Mormon than anyone else, has gone through the manuscripts, and he looked at the evidence in the original manuscript to see if he could see information about this mechanism of correction. And he found it for the spelling of odd names. And one of the most dramatic is Coriantumr. Now, Coriantumr in our current version is Corintumr. It was first spelled Tummer. So Coriantumr, because that UMR is an unusual spelling and the UMMER was more common. But it was immediately crossed out and then the new spelling put in. And so that's the process that you can verify that there was a correction. But there's a correction for name. There's no correction for any other spelling in the text. The other spelling in the text, like anybody in the 1830, it varies wildly. Spelling just wasn't standardized at the time. But we do have that one. Now, how does that correlate to what the witnesses say? Well, they didn't see what Joseph saw. They only heard. So what they heard was this process of correcting names, and they extrapolated from the correction of names that therefore everything would be correct.
Okay.
So we know from the actual evidence the kind of thing they were hearing. We know what was right. And we know that they thought it was more marvelous and wanted to make sure that people knew that it was divine. So they kind of added their spin on it. The other thing is, I've sort of dabbled in folklore as well and how folklore is generated and passed on. And the similarities that you see in the witness testimonies tell me that there are people talking about this, and that as they talk, they sort of coalesce on the story that they're telling, and they start looking more and more similar to each other, not because there was an original written source or the oral source, but because that's sort of the way the community developed the way to talk about these things.
Right. Okay. So you think the witnesses may have been mistaken? That's what they believed they were witnessing as he was dictating the Book of Mormon. And where would you lean in terms of, tight versus loose? Maybe you don't like that phrasing of it, but do you believe that Joe Smith was sort of seeing words on the stone, or do you believe the stone was more of a way to channel the revelation to come through, and he was sort of clothing the language?
That's again where things get way more complex, and probably gets us a little bit far away from historicity, but the evidence is really good that Joseph saw words. The question then is, where did those words come from? There is no way that I know of that words show up on rocks. Mm-hmm. So if you're looking at a seer stone, the words do not appear on a seer stone. If you look at the history of scrying in the world, you find it all over the world. You find it anciently, you find it in modern times. This idea that somebody will use some instrument to be able to see something.
Is kind of like a bit of a crystal ball claiming to see.
It's been around forever and ever. and in so many different cultures that you know that this is a human thing. Now, that doesn't mean that human things can't be inspired, because we're all humans, and we certainly hope that from time to time we get some inspiration. But what I think happens is that, those words are generated in Joseph's mental vision. And for those of you wondering what I mean, if you close your eyes and imagine your favorite pet, you can see your favorite pet with your eyes closed. We generate vision in our mind. So vision is not, we process it in our brain, and it doesn't mean that it actually has to have, even light coming in. And some people do this better than others. The one thing that I found as I was looking at this question of scrying, Andrew Lang was a British anthropologist from the late 1800s, and he got interested in scrying. And he got a little crystal ball, and he would hand it to people to see what they thought. And he said some people could see things in it, other people couldn't. He said, basically, if you're someone who can do this, you see something and other people can't. The story that I think is most important for the Book of Mormon about this idea of seeing the text, he handed it to this one young woman who looked at it and saw a paper with writing on it that was so real to her, she turned the ball over to find the paper that had the writing on it. Now, that's the only time I've ever seen, an indication that someone saw a page with writing, but she did. And if we know that she did, then it doesn't surprise me at all that Joseph would. And so then the question becomes, where do the words come from? And that's where I think the inspiration comes, where Joseph receives the meaning that's on the plates, and then he has to take that meaning and translate it into another language.
That's a pity. Joseph never left a very precise, detailed account of how the Book of Mormon was translated. Didn't Hiram Smith ask him once, tell us about it, and he said it's not for the world to know all the details for how the Book of Mormon came forth.
And frankly, I don't think he understood the process. I think Joseph was as amazed as to what happened. I don't think he knew details. And again, as I said at the beginning, this is still a controversial topic without, real conclusions. And obviously what you're getting is my opinion.
I want to hear your view.
But in my opinion, I believe that God inspired the Book of Mormon. I also believe that Joseph Smith was a human being who had a rather normal brain. And so normal human functions should be participants in the process of translation. And we know a lot about what translators do. People who speak two different languages immediately cross back and forth, but not necessarily in exactly the same words. The syntax will not be the same. There are connotations of words that will not translate to another language. You lose some of the aspects of the word when you move it to another language. So I think what happens is Joseph, understands what the plates mean, just as I would understand what, for example, a Spanish passage would mean, and then I would translate that into English, and it may or may not be a very precise translation, but it does translate the meaning as I understand it. And I think that explains, how it is that we get, and going back to what Royal said, a cultural translation. One of the places where I think it's most obvious to see a cultural translation is the agricultural metaphors we see in the Book of Mormon are Western European cultural metaphors. It's wheat production. It's production with plows. That imagery and language shows up in the Book of Mormon. That would have been absolutely understandable for Joseph Smith. That's what he knew. If he was going to talk about somebody planting, that's what's going to come to mind. It wasn't the way they did it anywhere in the Americas. The Americas just didn't have that kind of agriculture. They didn't do it that way. They would use a stick and And the most classic thing is you put the stick in the ground, you put in the corn, the beans, and the squash, and let them all grow together.
And
But
yeah,
that's,
and my
you don't
understanding
see
of
that in the Book of Mormon because Joseph wouldn't have known that.
right, yeah. And my understanding of sort of this, view of the translation, whether you want to call it loose or more of like just as a sort of co-participator, that he's receiving, revelation, whether it's not through the stone or sort of in his mind, he's channeling the revelation and he's having to translate it, but into his own words, his own vocabulary, which might explain for the 19th century elements or anachronisms that maybe seem more fatal if it was a very tight word for word translation. So we'll maybe go to, unless you have anything else to say on that, we'll go to maybe some of the offensive things that you think sort of support in the text, sort of like the historicity of the Book of Mormon, things in the text. I had a good discussion with Brian Hales, and he sort of outlined, the complexity of the book, like the internal geography and all the characters and all the plot lines, and just all the things that Joseph Smith would have had to have in his mind and remember and dictate. Hebraisms and chiasmus and things like that might support it, having some ancient origin. What are some things in the text that you find historically or compelling as historical?
Yeah, I'll give you that in a second, but let me sort of tag on to Brian Hale's stuff. There was a book put out called Visions in a Seer Stone, where it was talking about.
That's why Bill Davis, was it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
He's talking about the idea that extemporaneous speech culture, sermon culture, could explain the Book of Mormon. And the problem with that is, although it might explain some of the outline structures, there's a whole bunch of places where it kind of falls apart. And one of the places where it kind of falls apart is this question of memory. How much can you retain in memory? And the thing that becomes fascinating is the Book of Ether. The Book of Ether begins with this genealogy, and it lays out a genealogy, and it goes, let's see if I remember correctly, I think it goes backwards. Yeah, it goes from most recent down to ancient. And then the text starts and the story begins. And as it builds up, you get that same genealogy in reverse, but not all of the names because they're not all relevant. You get a whole bunch of other names in there. But if you follow out which lines, and it's an extremely complicated reversal.
Yeah, I find that quite impressive.
I mean, there's no way I can think of you can do that without having a text that you're reading. And now go back to Joseph Smith. There's a text that's written down, and I think it's being translated and given to Joseph as it was written down. It's just the language he uses for that written text will change. Now, back to historicity. So I think what happens with historicity, and the way that I understand it best to look at the text, is to be able to say the text makes very specific claims about places and time periods. And if you really are going to have an historical text, what the text says about its action should fit to a time and place. Now, we know that time and place when it starts in Jerusalem. So we know a lot about what's happening in Jerusalem in 600 BC and those ballpark years. So we can test the Book of Mormon to see if it fits with what's happening. The idea of a fleeing prophet from Jerusalem, that's not unusual. That actually happened, and we know historically of a couple of prophets who fled. Sadly, one of them fled to Egypt, which was a standard place of escape, but they got caught and brought back and killed. So the idea that a prophet in Jerusalem who is saying something unpopular might want to get out of town because they're threatening to kill him, which is exactly what the Book of Mormon says, has historical precedent. We know that was happening at that time. So yeah, the history works, it fits. The story of the the passage to get to the Bountiful, everything about that has correlation in historical events. Then you get some interesting things in the Book of Mormon where the background and the fact that they're traveling and moving explains events. We have this wonderful account of the broken bow. And we all read that. Yeah, it's a broken bow. It's a great story. I love the story. It's wonderful. But we never ask questions about the broken bow.
No.
Why did his brother's bows lose the string? Why does his break if it's a steel bow? How do you break a steel bow? We just don't ask those questions, but they're fascinating ones because what happens is when you change climates, it will affect wood. And if it affects wood and it dries out and it dries out and perhaps twists, your bow will lose its springs. It won't work very much anymore. And rather than a pure steel bow, it's usually a bow that has metal fittings on it, and the wood changes behind it and therefore breaks because part of it can't move and the rest of it does. I learned about this firsthand when we were married. We got a little tiny chopping block, a cutting board that was butcher board, and it was made of the small squares. Beautiful little piece. I loved it. And we moved to a dry climate and the thing split. And there was just a hole in the thing and you couldn't use it because there was a big split. And we took it with us when we moved back to New York, which was a much more humid climate. Healed right up, just back together because the humidity got into the, and so, humidity is affecting the wood. And so you say, well, why do you get this story? It's a wonderful little, but it fits the fact that they're moving from a little bit more moist climate into a very arid climate. And when they move into the more arid climate, things dry out and the woods change. So that historical fit to say that occurs, it occurs at that place and it occurs for a logical reason. If you're making up stories, you've got to be a really good author to make that story up. And then, of course, we get to the archaeological information about Nahom. And there's a lot of controversy about this, but the two things that are important is we now know that there was an area that that has a name very similar to what we see in the Book of Mormon. We know that it's in the correct place because it talks about this is where they make a change and shift their direction. And they know there are two trails from there, one, the more common one for the frankincense trail, and then a lesser traveled trail that is much more difficult and more dangerous, which appears to be the one they took, which is why they talk about problems and not having fire. But anyway, the archaeological evidence that there really was this place, and we have also found out that it was a place that had a cemetery, and it was a cemetery that that is known to have housed people from the outside as they're traveling through, and that's where Ishmael was buried. So, and we found the name Ishmael. Now we did.
I think, am I right as well in the text that they're naming all these places as they're traveling through, like the Arabian desert, but when they bury Ishmael, they say it was called Nahom, so that it's not a name that they're giving to it.
Yeah, so it's a name that was already there. And just as a side note, the Nahom, it appears in the Book of Mormon to have in both Western, I think it's Southern Semitic, whatever language they're using, I can't remember which one. Not my field.
That's okay.
But the language that's used in that altar that they found that has the name on it, just like Hebrew, will only use the consonants. And so the vowels that we have in the Book of Mormon are pretty much pointed based on the Hebrew and go along with the idea of mourning and suffering. The meaning that probably happened in the vowels that would have been used in that language would have been stonework and cutting stone. And so they're not exactly the same. But if you think of somebody who's writing and they know that the language has the the same consonants. What you're seeing is a pun. It's a linguistic pun.
Right.
It's because it fits the story. You take it and you massage it a little bit and you put it in that context.
It doesn't say like Ishmael's daughters, mourned over their father, and you're saying that Nahom means to mourn in Hebrew. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah, and that's what I'm saying is the Hebrew works, even though the language that is written there had a different meaning and was probably Nahom rather than Nahom.
Right.
But still, it fits with the way the text is being written. Then they go to Bountiful, and of course, finding a place in what we have assumed to be a very desert area, finding a place that fits Bountiful was kind of surprising. But there's actually two good locations for where Bountiful would have been.
Yeah.
And I don't know enough to be able to tell you which one's which, but the fact that you
I can't even remember the names, but I know you talk about it in the book.
Yeah. But all of that, where you go to the old world, say, okay, old world, yeah, that kind of fits. Well, then you go to the new world, and the problem, of course, is where do you go in the new world? And without spending the time to justify it, the best evidence is that the Nephites would have landed on the coast of Guatemala. Now, if you land on the coast of Guatemala, there's mountains that will come up off the coast. And at the time of the Book of Mormon, we know that there were at least 6 communities in those mountains that had at least 1,000 people each. So Nephites are not coming into, Lehites are not coming into a naked land. Frankly, there wasn't anywhere in the New World they could have gone that was habitable, that was not inhabited. So it's not surprising that they're going to meet with people, but they're landing on this coast based on the text and the fact that the text consistently talks about up as going up in elevation, down as going down in elevation, over typically indicates you're going over a mountain range or something. But with all of those terms, it looks like then they go up into what would have been highland Guatemala, which is where we have the beginnings for the Nephites.
Yeah.
And then we have stories that occur there. And most interestingly is right at the beginning, we just have this relatively small community of people who are Nephites. And again, I think other people had to be assimilated into them, or else nothing about the story works. Nothing about history would work, because there were people there.
So they were intermingling with other civilizations that had been there for thousands of years before.
Both historically, because of who was there, and based on, again, reading through the lines of the texts. Both of those absolutely require that there are other people that they met. Although, again, going back to the idea that some people would like to read it simplistically, they say, well, nobody's mentioned, so therefore it's not there.
Yeah.
Talk to the guy who wrote the record for a completely different reason. Had no interest in that. Didn't know we would be as curious about it as we are. But here's the point that's interesting. You get this small community. This is beginning. There's just not that many people there that we could tell. We don't know how many, but small. But one of the first things they do is they say, Nephi, we want you to be a king. Now, again, because we read that ahistorically, we don't see it as something that's really strange, but it is. Small communities don't have kings. You don't start off with kings. You might have, anthropologically, they start with a headman in a village, just an important guy.
Like the mayor.
Yeah, and you might go to a chief.
Yeah.
But we get him right at kings, and we get this community saying, we want you to be a king. And of course, Nephi knows what a king is, and he's had a problem with, kings in, Babylon, and, problems that, some of the kings of Israel got them in trouble with Babylon and Egypt and all of the rest. So Nephi doesn't want to be a king, but they say, oh, no, you got to be a king. Well, why would the people want him to be a king? Well, it just so happens in about 600 BC, in that ballpark of time, in that area, in island Guatemala, the Maya civilization is developing kingship, and that's when we're starting to see kingship develop. And so it's kind of like, well, look, they got a king. Everybody else has got a king. We need a king. So why is it that that's one of the first things they ask? Because everybody else is doing it. And so historically, it fits. We're not going to see that problem of you've got to have a king later on. It's assumed that you have kings because later on, that's the norm. But what we're seeing right in 600 BC is that's the beginning.
Right.
In the early period of time, we have Jacob who gets mad at the Nephites because they have costly apparel and they have a whole bunch of concubines, and
Yeah, I remember that
right off
chapter.
the bat. Yeah, and again, why? Well, again, historically, those two things actually go together. You cannot have costly apparel if everybody's making the same thing from the same materials. It's, if you're wearing exactly the same thing that somebody else has, that's not considered costly apparel. It's costly apparel when it's different, when it's unusual, and that's trade. And in order to trade, you have to have something to trade, but you're bringing things back in. And one of the ways that the Maya would display their wealth so people knew who they were, how important they were, is by the clothing that they would wear. And so this idea of costly apparel, it fits into the idea that they're trying to create an identity. They're starting to trade to get richer. And then we start to see social separation with people who have more and less. The other thing is, if you're going to trade, you have to have something to trade, so you need to develop it. And one of the mechanisms that many people have used and was used in Mesoamerica at that time was you had bigger families. You got more wives so that you could have more children, so you could build your factory, if you will, based on what your family produced. And so you would have more wives to have more children, to have more people to produce, to be able to trade with someone and to get more wealth and to bring it in. And those two things go together at a specific time period, a specific sort of socioeconomic confluence of elements that are happening at that point in time in that area, and we see it in the Book of Mormon. Now, we no longer get that confluence. We get the idea of costly apparel, and that becomes a code word for social segregation. You see so costly apparel in the Book of Mormon, and you know that the Nephites are moving away from their ideals. But at the beginning, those two things show up because they are related. And we don't know that unless we know the cultural background.
Right.
We have, again, moving through time and space. The next really, really big thing that happens in time and space in the Book of Mormon is that you have Nephites who are fleeing the land of Nephi. They go down to Zarahemla, which means they're at a higher elevation. They're going over a mountain range and they come down lower. And that relationship between the land of Zarahemla and the land of Nephi is always one where you go up to the land of Nephi and down to the land of Zarahemla.
The Book of Mormon's consistent with that, isn't it? It doesn't get really confused.
No, they're not. Yeah, it's absolutely consistent. Which is one of the ways that you figure out geography for the Book of Mormon. It has to fit with all of these ups and downs and elevations and overs.
And you would hold more to the John Sorenson sort of model of in Mesoamerica.
That's the one I think works
most likely.
Yeah, I think it has the best correlations. And one of them is when you come to this place in Zarahemla, which he would place along the Grijalba. I like that correlation because it fits with the history of the area that we know. So what we have in the Book of Mormon is we have the description of a Sidon River. We have a description of this land of Nephi. They follow the Sidon down. They get to a place that's called Zarahemla. When the people from Highland Guatemala, which was a Maya-speaking area, come down into this land of Zarahemla, if that is the Grijalva River, we know archaeologically something about the people who were there. They were Soke speakers. They were not Maya speakers. Soke and Maya are mutually unintelligible languages, kind of like Russian and English. There's just no real connection between the languages. So what happens in the Book of Mormon? It says they get there and they said they can't understand each other. Well, why not? If we look at the history of the area, in that area, there were Soke speakers, and of course they wouldn't have understood each other. Later on, the Book of Mormon will talk about the people of Zarahemla, and they'll talk about them being related to the people of Mulek, who, were another group that came in, but were more northerly.
He was claimed to be the son of Zedekiah, the king, wasn't it? And he left with a group of people and went over.
Yeah. That's the history, the story that we get in the Book of Mormon. But in the Zarahemla, we've got these people that say that they, were connected to them. Well, that's the Soke language is connected to that part of the land, and this group has, we know that they're traveling down the river. So everything about the meeting of Mosiah and his people with this other group of people that they don't understand, have lost their religion, all of that is explained by that culture, that time, and what's happening in that location. Now, the other thing that's explained by that geography that's kind of fascinating is later on we have people from Zarahemla that go back to the land of Nephi, and they get oppressed by the Lamanites that are there. They want to go back to the land of Zarahemla, but for some reason, when they send people off to find Zarahemla to say, please come help us, they get lost. And when they get lost, they end up in Jaredite territory. Well, that's an interesting story. And again, we typically don't think much about it. But the problem is, how in the world do you get lost? This is like the second generation, and your grandparents were the ones who came from Zarahemla. And so, how do you get there? If you haven't been there, how do you go back? Well, you ask the people who know, you ask the stories. It says, look, you go up into the mountains, you find the head of the riverside, and you follow the river, and you can't miss it. It's on the left. And you can't miss it. How do you skip it? And the answer is there are two major rivers in that area, both of which are very close to each other in the Cuchumatanes Mountains, and they went to the wrong river. And if you follow the wrong river, eventually you come up into Jaredite territory and you miss Zarahemla entirely. So the geography of the area tells us why that story works, where if we don't have that geography, and they don't mention the second river, the Book of Mormon isn't concerned with that other river. But that other river that's there and not mentioned gives us an historical background that allows us to understand the text,
right?
That otherwise we wouldn't do. Now, I'll skip forward a lot, and then I'll let you ask questions if you've got some.
Yeah, no, keep going.
Can
I just interject one question that
go ahead.
This sort of view of the Mesoamerican geography, this model, it's a very small geographical area, because the assumption or the view that the church has had, I think probably from Joseph Smith up until probably recent decades, is we believe that the Nephites and the Lamanites, when they arrived, that they inhabited the entire country of North and South America, and we'll maybe bring this up later, because some people might look at quotes about them, inhabiting to the lands, north, to the sea north, to the sea south and west. And it does make it seem, when you read it in that sense, that they're filling the whole continent. And that, Native Americans, they descend from, from the Lamanites, which we'll talk about later when we come to DNA. But this sort of reading of, the distances they were traveling, and scholars looking more at the text, it seems like it's more of a smaller landmass. It wasn't the entire continent. the Lamanites and Nephites were traveling across?
There's a couple of really important things to know about that. First, absolutely, that was what the popular belief was, and Joseph Smith believed it. Most of his fellow members would believe it, and it was all north and south. And of course, if you see a map, there is a very obvious narrow neck of land, and land northward and land southward, and the
Yeah,
whole
you just
idea.
think North, South America,
Yeah, I
Mexico's the
mean,
narrow neck of
if
land.
you look at the Panama Canal, I mean, if you look at a map, that's a narrow neck of land, and so the land northward is North America, the land southward is South America, and because you can see a map and you can see how South America looks like it might be surrounded by water, you go, oh yeah, yeah. So that's what
Did
they believe. We
did
know for
Moroni,
sure.
when he visited Joseph Smith, I actually can't remember this. Did he say to Joseph Smith that the Nephites and the Lamanites there are the principal ancestors of the Native Americans? I know it's in the title page of the Book of
Yeah,
Mormon, which has been, I think, was that written by Bruce R. McConkie or someone who claimed that,
originally, and then it was modified. Yeah,
yes, it was modified.
yeah.
But was Joseph Smith told that by the angel Moroni?
We have no indication that he did. The only indication we have that there was some instruction was Joseph apparently did see some visions of the people that he was talking about. His
Yes.
mother mentions that he would see these,
And like
but
tell them as like oral
yeah,
stories about the Native
yeah.
Americans and
If
their.
it, and people think, well, okay, if he had the visions, therefore he knew what the geography was. But I don't know if you've ever taken one of these geography tests where they show you a picture and say, where does this come from? If you just see a picture of a place, frequently you have no idea where the place would be. Now, if you see a desert, you know that it was a desert. But if you just see trees like you normally see, you have no clue what you're
Right.
looking at. And I've traveled to a couple of places, and I was in Thailand, and I'm expecting vegetation in Thailand to be totally different. It wasn't that different. It was some. If I were a good botanist, I'd see the differences, but it wasn't like going to a jungle or anything like that. I mean, there's deciduous trees. So I think when we know that Joseph Smith had a vision of the people, that doesn't mean he had a vision and a knowledge of geography. There's just no indication that he did. In 1879, Orson Pratt put footnotes into the Book of Mormon, and he added things about geography, and he totally believed that it was all of North and South America. And that was the popular belief. And I remember that's what I was taught. I'm old enough
Yeah,
that this was a while
I was the
ago.
same.
Yeah, I mean, and so that's the understanding. It's the scholarly work that's been done since then that starts to narrow it down. And they start looking at the important things. And that's work that began starting in 1920. And then we got some of the definitions more in the 1940s and 1950s. But that's when the scholars were really looking at this and saying, no, it cannot be. It has to be much more concentrated. And that's when, John Sorenson is the one that sort of came up with the most complete correlation between geography and text, where he lined as many things up as he possibly could.
Right.
Many geographies cheat a little bit and ignore things that they don't want to talk about.
Hmm.
And Sorenson was influenced by Mesoamerican. I think he wanted certain things to be in certain places. But overall, it works really well. But again, one of the things you mentioned is things have shrunk to maybe 800 miles top to bottom, 600 miles, a couple hundred miles east to west. And interestingly enough, in the Book of Mormon, people will always say that, oh yeah, the Book of Mormon has a North Sea and a South Sea, an East and a West. What's really fascinating is the only places where you see the North and the South Sea is when they're talking about the whole world. And in Mesoamerica, their conception of the world was that they were surrounded by water. So the Mesoamerican conception was regardless of what you see and where you are, conceptually you're surrounded by water. And so there would be a North and a South Sea. But you never see any event of the Book of Mormon happen at a North Sea or a South Sea. Nothing ever happens. The only time you see that is when they're saying, this is the whole world. The
Right.
East Sea and the West Sea, things happen. You have people who go back and forth. You have battles that occur on the East and the West coasts, but never on the North and South. So again, going back to the text and what the text will tell you, the text tells me there's an East Sea and a West Sea. It tells me that it's a conceptual use of the North and South Seas, and that I shouldn't be looking for them.
So would you interpret when it talks about, I think I have the scripture in Helaman where it talks about them, like the Nephites filling, all the way to the North Sea and to the South Sea. Are you saying that they probably never got that close to the North or South Sea and they maybe realize all the land between them and,
this goes back
Canada?
to language. We have certain phrases that we use that mean something but don't mean exactly what they say, such as, if I've told you once, I've told you 1,000 times.
Mm-hmm.
We know that. We know the phrase, and as parents, we've said that to kids. Well, we've never counted to find out how many times. I have no idea if I've actually said something 1,000 times. But when I'm saying it, it's 1,000 times. There are phrases that we use. We'll use the term kick the bucket, and it has nothing to do with buckets and nothing to do with kicking. But it's a phrase that we use to have meaning. There is a phrase in the Book of Mormon that we also will get out of the Bible, which is to have something cover the whole face of the land.
Yes.
Well, that just means everything I know about. Doesn't mean the entire hemisphere, doesn't mean anything. If you see that in the Bible, it doesn't mean it happened in China. The whole face of the land is everything that I know about.
Right.
When it says it goes to the north, it covers all of the land from the north to the south, that's again metaphorical. It's just saying they went north and they went south, and these people are everywhere. One of the things that's again important to understand, if you're looking at the Book of Mormon as a real text that was written by real people, at that time period, you don't have maps like we have. We have seen Mesoamerican maps, and they don't look like maps that we have. They'll have a few mountains here and there, and sometimes the mountains are placed very nicely in four corners. Now, realistically, they're not there, but conceptually they are. And the map gives it to you conceptually. So their concept of maps and ours are extremely different. I have a friend of mine who was a nurse and went on a medical mission to the Philippines. And he was talking to someone that they had to have, and this guy that he was talking to was Filipino, had driven in Manila forever. And Manila is a complicated city, apparently. And they were trying to tell him how to go somewhere. And so they pulled out a map to show him where they wanted him to go. And the guy looks at this cross-eyed and he's going, I don't understand. I don't know what this is. And they said, well, you have to imagine you're a bird flying above it. And he's going, oh, okay. If you live your life on the ground and you do not fly above the earth, you do not see the earth in the same way. You don't have the same perspective. And so when they talk about the whole earth, they talk about what they know about, not what we see.
Yeah, they wouldn't have a bird's eye view of the whole continent.
Yeah, it's a foreign concept. They don't have that. They don't know that. And so, when we deal with an ancient text that's talking about directions and geography, trying to read our ideas back into it without allowing for what they were like is a misunderstanding.
Right. Is there anything you want to share with regards to any historical evidence to support the Book of Mormon, or do you want to transition towards more of a defense and responding to maybe some of the issues or things critics might point to?
Let me give you one more, and then we'll move to that.
Perfect.
The Book of Mormon ends, as you said, 404 AD, 400, 420. And actually, one of the things that I think happens in the Book of Mormon is that we use a 365-day year, and I think they used a different year, a shorter lunar year.
Oh yes, you talked about that in the book. What was it, like 340 something days or something like that?
I think it's closer to 360, but basically what happens is their year is shorter, and therefore they don't, when they say, well, the biggest example is 600 years from the time Lehi leaves Jerusalem to the time Christ is born. And the Book of Mormon counts them out. This is not an approximation for them. They tell you that it's 600 years. They mark out the years to make sure they know that it's 600 of them. But we know it wasn't, because we know that it's like 587, 589. I think at 589, Babylon is coming in. So, and then we have Christ being born. Most of the scholars give us like, BC, 4 BC. So that's not 600 years. But if you use this shorter calendar, it is, so it's the shortened years. The reason I mention that is when we get to the end of the Book of Mormon, we've got the same problem. Our years, it's 400 to 420, and it would have been a little bit shorter than that. That becomes important because of history. We get the Book of Mormon, and the Book of Mormon ends, and the Nephites are gone, and we're sad. But we, again, don't ask ourselves, look, they've been fighting Lamanites all the time. What did it finally happen then? What is different about this time? And even in Mormon's discussion, he says, my father went down, we beat the Lamanites back. And then he mentions that these Gadiantons show up and that the Gadiantons are all over the place. And in the way Mormon tells the Book of Mormon, he uses the Gadiantons as sort of the ultimate boogeyman of, what causes the end of civilization. And looking at again, what's happening culturally, I've made the argument elsewhere, and it's a long argument, so I won't try to, synopsize it here, but I see the Gadiantons as being references to Teotihuacan, which is a location to the north. And this is at the time of the end of the Book of Mormon. This is a time when Teotihuacan is getting very powerful and very influential. And one of the things that you have to know, assuming that most of the people who are listening, watching, are intimately familiar with the ancient geography of Mexico and Central America, Teotihuacan's in kind of the heart, Mexico City, not too far away from Mexico City, maybe an hour's drive. But Mexico City, kind of in the heart of Mexico. And then down south, get my hands where you can see them, down south, you got Teotihuacan up here. Down here, you have Guatemala. Down in the heel of the boot, if you imagine that area of Mexico. And that's where the Maya are. We have records that in 378 AD, Teotihuacan is invading the Maya area. And so they're coming from the north and going down through the south, going through the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, which would be the narrow neck of land in most Mesoamerican concepts of geography. And now you have a really powerful Maya culture, a really powerful Teotihuacano culture that are connecting, and there's really strong ties, and they want to have economic ties between the two. And sitting right across the trade routes in that narrow neck of land are the Nephites. And right at that point in time, it finally becomes economically feasible to have a war of destruction. Wars where you try to eliminate a people are very economically destructive. They're expensive. And so you've got to have a really good reason to want to get rid of somebody. And apparently that was the reason. So when we get to the history of Mesoamerica, at that time period, we can explain why the Nephites were destroyed at that point, and they never were before, and why things were different at that time period. And it will correlate with how the Book of Mormon is describing things. So again, going with time, place, location, those locations will tell us things about the Book of Mormon that say, yeah, this is why the story occurred the way it does. It just didn't happen that way because Joseph Smith didn't have any other way to end his book. There was a historical reason that this was happening. Okay, so that's the end of those historical correlations between time and place.
And again, I'll hold up the book and encourage if you want to find out more to
it's all in there.
Purchase the book. It's all in there. But no, that was really, really fascinating. I think it's good as well to see those parallels as well. I think that's really interesting. So if we transition now to just getting maybe your take on maybe some of the criticisms or issues people have, and I don't think it's so much just people just wanting to poke at the Book of Mormon, but some people do have genuine issues.
Sure,
You know, I've got
of
friends,
course.
family members, and even my own things that I'm sort of wrestling and navigating my way through. And I think you've also maybe addressed your view of translation not being so much word for word, and that might be a way to and you've touched on anachronisms, and that might help you in how you sort of navigate through some of the issues people point to. But nonetheless, I wanted to sort of share some of those things that
Sure.
people point to and just get your take. So some critics would point to like there's a lack of just archaeological evidence, and you sort of laid out
Yeah.
archaeological evidence as you see it, but they would say there's no clear archaeological evidence, at least in the New World. And they point to anachronisms, which we touched on earlier, like elephants, horses, sheep, goats,
Yeah.
steel swords, a lack of evidence from metallurgy. And if you take the text at face value, it's out of time and place. And somebody would say if there's an anachronism in the text, that sort of proves it's not ancient. And maybe your view of just translation, not word for word, but just touch on your thoughts on
Yeah.
the anachronisms.
There's two issues there, and I really want to spend some of the time on the idea that there's no archaeological evidence, because I see that a lot. A lot of people and a lot of Latter-day Saints are saying, well, there's no archaeological evidence. Excuse me. So the Book of Mormon must not be historical. It must be metaphorical because there's no archaeological evidence.
Yeah.
And you remember I said one of the sub-themes would be that things are more complex and they're not simple.
Mm-hmm.
The idea of archaeological evidence is much more complex. And one of the reasons is people don't understand archaeology. They don't really know what it means or what people are coming up with and how they do it. And what they really, really, really don't understand is the difference between Old World and New World archaeology. And I'll
Yes.
tell you in a nutshell what that difference is. Texts. The difference between the Old World and the New World is the ability of a text to inform archaeology. So archaeologists will go out and they'll dig in a place and they find broken potsherds, and they pull up pots and they look at the pots and the decorations on the pots, and they'll pull up tools. And sometimes they'll pull up something and I'm not sure what this is, but the text will give us information. And then texts will tell you, well, here's what the city was, here's when it existed, here's what people were doing. And so we can say, here's Jerusalem. We've always known where Jerusalem was. So when we dig up archaeology, we are learning about Jerusalem. We know what it is and where. We can use the text to find other places, and we go through and dig those up. Cultural will tell us, for example, we have artifacts from Egypt and we have artifacts from Assyria that will show up at different times and places in Israel. And we know why, because the texts tell us about these interactions.
Right.
You get to the New World and you do not, well, you have one now. At one point in time, we did not have any texts that were really part of Book of Mormon times. Nothing we could read. There is now one, but we can't read all of it because it's an earlier version of the Maya script and they haven't fully translated that earlier version. But there is now a text that's in one of the temples they found in San Bartolo. But without text, what you have is an artifact and you have to put the context into it. The next thing is, without text, you have to decide who did it. So, for example, we talked earlier about the Jaredites. Well, the Jaredites are around at the same time that archaeologists, and in, we would believe, the same region as the archaeologists call the Olmec people.
Yes.
The Olmec people is interesting because, as all, archaeology, all of the things that you read about, the modern writers will talk about the Olmec, which was a name they got by mistake. There were a people historically that were the Olmec that lived in this area. And so when they started finding these remains, they said, oh, they must be Olmec remains. And then they found out that they were way older than the Olmec. And they go, oh, shoot. but they'd already named them that. And so they shifted the name of the newer group to the Olmeca Xicalaca so that you could distinguish this made up name for these people from the place where they got the name. So the Olmec were never called themselves the Olmec. What we know of the Maya, they really never considered themselves, a people. They spoke Maya. They may have known the term, but they would have never categorized themselves as Maya. They would have categorized themselves. Well, if you remember Greek history, you have Athenians who are from Athens. We have Spartans who are from Sparta. Those are cities. They're in Greece. You spoke the same language, but they considered themselves very different.
Right.
That's the way it would have been in Mesoamerica. You were identified by the city. Even in modern terms, anthropologists and linguists will go to certain Maya and they'll say, well, these other people are Maya as well, aren't they? No, there's a completely different city. We're not like them at all. So they speak the same language, but we're not like them at all. We're different. So when we get into the Book of Mormon and we start talking about archaeological evidence, they're saying, well, we don't have anything that matches, but they miss the complexity of the problem. So for example, somebody would say there's no archaeological evidence that there were Christians in the New World. Okay, think about that one for a second. How would I know that there was a Christian in the New World? Well, of course, I know there's a Christian in the New World because there would be a cross. We'd see symbolism of fish and loaves because that was all over the place. There's certain things that we just know. The Cairo, there's certain. All of those are after 600 BC. Every single one of those symbols that defines Christianity was developed in the Old World and very frequently borrowed from the iconography of other peoples in the area. So, for example, the earliest depictions of Jesus borrowed the depictions from Apollo. The whole idea of the halo that the saints have, that came from the sun disk behind Apollo from Greek mythology. So a lot of the iconography was borrowed from somebody else and appropriated into Christianity. What about the cross? Well, interestingly enough, we do find a cross in Mesoamerica, but it really has nothing to do with the Christian cross, other than it's a cross. But if you think about the story of the Book of Mormon, although Nephi early on, 600 years before Christ, predicts that he'll be crucified, that's never a theme for the Book of Mormon. It never shows up. When the Book of Mormon deals with Jesus Christ, they deal with him as a resurrected God who has descended to them. That's not what you're going to use to depict a cross. There's no cross imagery that is even relevant to the Nephites. And so it's not going to be there.
Because they're saying Christ is not crucified, but as the resurrected Son of God.
So, why isn't there Christian iconography? Because you're asking the wrong question. If there are Christians in the New World, what will their iconography be? Well, they will borrow iconography just like other people did and adapt it to their meanings. How do you know the difference? You don't, unless you know the context. So when they say, there's no Christian archaeology, nope, but why would there be? You're asking the wrong questions.
And you talk, there's a chapter in your book where you talk about the, I don't know if I can say his name right, Quetzalcoatl, is that his name? Yes.
Yeah, nobody pronounces that one right.
Yeah, sorry. And because I remember like growing up and people would have pointed to that, the white god among the, the Mesoamericans, and that was, Jesus. But you talk about how the parallels aren't really that strong for that.
No.
It's not good scholarship.
They're not good at all. And what they really are most instructive about is what I was saying earlier about the Spanish. You have to learn how to read between the lines. And I think the lesson there is if you read too simplistically, if you assume that things are, again, on the surface, and that if I just look at that surface, I can make decisions, you miss the important parts of both the Book of Mormon and history, because it's way more complex than all of that. So John Clark is a Latter-day Saint archaeologist. While he was employed as an archaeologist, he stayed very far away from Book of Mormon things because he wanted to be seen as, an archaeologist of the area, and he's extremely well known, well respected. He did finally start talking a little bit about the Book of Mormon and archaeology. And one of the things that he said is really important. He said, we have Book of Mormon archaeology in virtually every museum in the Americas. The problem is there's no way to know how it's different from anything else. None of them say, this is Nephi's bone, this is Nephi's pot.
Right.
How
can you identify it as a Nephite artifact?
Now, if you think about it, you and I are in two different countries. And in two different countries, if we walked outside and got into an automobile, you would recognize my automobile and I would recognize yours. There is nothing Latter-day Saint about either of them. There's a whole bunch of people that have the same vehicle that I do and a whole bunch of people that have the same vehicle that you do. If our vehicles got buried, no one would ever know that a Latter-day Saint owned them. If I look at the pots and pans you cook in a completely different country now, we're a long way apart. I look at your pots and pans, they're going to look like my pots and pans. They're not that different.
Yeah.
And none of them will mark me as a Latter-day Saint. So the material culture that we live in is rarely defined by the people that are living there. And it used to be archaeologically, more than that. People tended to be more isolated, and they weren't a worldwide thing like we are this in modern life. But still, you go back to Israel and you get building styles that come in from Assyria. Even the first temple in Jerusalem was built on an Assyrian model for what a temple should look like. Was it an Israeli temple, a Hebrew temple, or an Assyrian temple? Well, the context and the things in it would tell you, but the architecture might not have, because it was borrowed from somebody else.
Right. Okay.
So
some of the artifacts that may be found may not be able to identify this is a Nephi or a Lamanite artifact.
Yeah, if they're living in the same area, it's not unusual that they would have very similar artifacts and similar styles. How do we know what clothing we should wear? Well, everybody else is wearing it. That's what we should wear.
Okay.
So I think that's what happens, and it's very much like John Clark says. Yeah, we've got Nephite artifacts all over the place. We just don't know how to identify them as Nephite. We call them Maya. We call them something else. But that's because we don't have a text that goes with them that will allow identification. So back to the original question is, do we have Book of Mormon archaeology? Is there archaeology? Well, let's ask the question a different way. How well does the archaeology that we know line up with the text? Now, when we use that, when we're saying, how does the archaeology that we know line up with the way the text changes through time, works in place, informs the way people make decisions, informs changes through time, and as I just said, why things end when they do, then there is pretty good archaeological evidence of the Book of Mormon, because it tells us that the Book of Mormon fits very nicely into what we know archaeologically was happening. And then the second thing is, texts and archaeology are two entirely different modes of communication, and they don't always overlap. And any good archaeologist will tell you that archaeology and text are related to each other, but they are not precise. There are things that you learn from archaeology that will contradict the text. And that doesn't mean that other things in the text are wrong. It just means the way we write and the way we tell stories is not the same as the way an archaeologist tells their story.
Right. And my understanding as well, according to like National Geographic, that less than 1% of archaeological sites have been excavated, and then recent LiDAR technology. So we don't know everything there is to know about Mesoamerica.
Yeah, and that goes back to what I said at the beginning about patience. Things are continually getting better. If the Book of Mormon had no correlation to history at all, things should be getting worse and worse and worse the more
Over
we
time.
discover.
Right. Yeah.
And it's exactly the reverse. Things are getting better. One of my colleagues, Matt Roper, is working on finishing up a project that I guess he worked with John Clark on, where they looked at some of these anachronisms and they said, here are the things that were anachronistic in 1830. Here are the things that by another point in time, we've found since then. Here's what's happened since then. And he's filling that chart out. And a lot of the things that we used to think didn't fit, we're going, oh yeah, we found that. We know what that is now.
Mm.
So yeah, if the Book of Mormon were not historical, we should be finding more and more evidence that shuts it down completely.
Right.
And that's the reverse of what's happening. Everything we're finding increases our information about the Book of Mormon, improves our understanding about the text, fits better with what we see in the archaeology.
And your thoughts on some of those specific, like physical anachronisms I pointed to? Would you believe that perhaps, we might still find them with more archaeology, or do you believe that those were 19th century elements Joe Smith might have?
There are certain, well, let me take the other side. Not anachronisms that are there, but things that one would presume should be there.
Right.
For example, jaguars. Why don't we see jaguars in the Book of Mormon?
I think Michael Coe talked about that in an interview.
Absolutely. And a lot of this stuff is what Michael Coe is looking at. And again, you go back to translation. You go to translation, you say, okay, what's in Joseph's head? What vocabulary terms does he have access to? There is an important animal in Mesoamerica, which is an ocelot.
It's like a small cat, isn't it?
It's one of the big cats. It's a spotted cat,
like a little cheetah,
bobcat size.
Right.
Yeah, I'm not real good on the comparative size, but certainly smaller than a jaguar, larger than a house cat, and still lethal. But it's an important animal. There's no way in the world that Joseph Smith would know to use the word ocelot. And if he did, he would have been wrong, because ocelot is an Aztec word, and the Aztec word comes too late and wouldn't have been what the people in the Book of Mormon used. So, yeah, how do you come up with a word for something where you don't know what that animal is? It's something you've never heard of before. So you use a term that you have access to. And I think that's the important part of translation. The reason why understanding translation helps us understand the way we understand the Book of Mormon as a text.
Well, what are your thoughts on words like
something you didn't know?
What are your thoughts on words? Because I know the Book of Mormon talks about like curelums and cumoms, and things like C9, and
that was fascinating.
Yeah, because a critic might push back and say that those words wouldn't have been in Joseph Smith's vocabulary, so under maybe a looser translation view, is he just making up those words?
That one goes back to names. Although you say that there's I'm a big proponent of the idea of a loose translation, but not for names, because we have evidence that those were not. Names are controlled. So somehow the names are important. Now, as a side note, why would the names be important? It turns out that many of the names have Hebrew etymologies that you can discover that actually have meaning inside the text and inside the story. Matt Bowen's done a lot of work on this, and it's just this fascinating sidelight where the names actually have meaning and the meaning fits what's in the story. And those are techniques that we see in the Bible, where names have meaning for the story that may or may not have been the name of the person, if you saw it on a historical record. But anyway, that's side note. But back to curelum and cumon, why are those names transliterated where the others, you pop in the English word? I think it's because of where they came from. They came from the plates of ether. When Joseph is getting translations of Nephite text, he's getting the impressions and he translates it. When he gets to the Book of Ether, Moroni is the one who is doing the translation. And I suspect that Moroni had no idea what a curelum or a cumum was. And so he transliterated them. And because he didn't know, there was nothing to transmit to Joseph about what the animal may or may not have been like. The only thing he could get was the name. And so you get the name just like you get the name Helaman or Coriantum or any of the other names. So I think that that's the best explanation for those as to why those are tight translations as opposed to the rest of them where I would say it's a loose translation.
Okay, got you. So maybe go into, some people have issues with regards to things that might seem 19th century in the text. And again, this might be going back to the tight versus loose translation, but there's a lot of the King James Bible in the Book of Mormon.
Yeah.
Like there's the long passages from, Isaiah chapters, maybe not word for word, some small changes, but long quotations, the Sermon on the Mount. And people are also concerned not only that there's, 17th century King James Bible passages in the translation, but also some of the errors from that translation, find their way through as well. And to some people, it might call into question, it's, is this an ancient text if it has sort of modern errors, and what are those doing in? Would you just be able to give sort of your take on that?
There's sort of two things that you're looking at with all of those questions that you just asked. So I'll divide them. And the one I'll talk about second is second Isaiah, the issue of Isaiah in the Book of Mormon. The first set, which is King James language, the fact that the Book of Mormon follows the King James language even when there's a better translation available.
Yeah.
The whole idea of it brings in errors that gets complicated, and there's a longer story than we want to deal with.
Yeah, because some of them are just more like the italics, and then some are maybe actually mistranslations. Yeah,
everybody messes up the whole idea of what italics do and don't do and what they're doing there.
Because the italics that are meant to make it more readable, is that the correct understanding? It's sort of like a variation, the italics, but then I'm also aware that some errors are just mistranslations where the translators just mistranslated something.
Those are really important when you're discussing how Joseph Smith translated. The italics in the King James Version are there because those are words that are not in the underlying text, but are implied in the text. And that just has to do with the nature of language.
And
some
translation
language requires different words. So in Spanish, for example, the verbs include the noun. So I can use a verb and everybody knows the noun that is implied, because I don't have to say I am. I can just say am, but the conjugation of that tells me it's I instead of you. So when you get to English, you have to put that back in. You can't replicate that. And so in King James Version, they put those in italics. Well, people in Joseph Smith's day knew that those things were added, and not all the time, but frequently Joseph Smith will delete them. That's a real interesting question about the nature of translation. It tells us that he was looking at a text that had italics, and how he was doing that when his face was buried in a hat is an interesting question.
Yeah, what are your thoughts on, well, I'll let you finish your point, but the follow-up question I was going to ask is, there's also a division. Some scholars believe he might have consulted a King James Bible, and was, when he was quoting long passages, there must have been a Bible used. And other people would say, no, that was just what was either coming through his mind.
There is a big problem. That's the big problem with what we have in the book, with understanding the translation. It is absolutely clear, and I would argue it with anybody that Joseph Smith was looking at a page, and this again is most often in Isaiah. He's looking at a page of Isaiah that looks like the King James Version. It has the italics, and you can tell that he's interacting with that because he interacts at the place where the italics are, and sometimes he'll delete them, and sometimes after deleting them, he has to put words back in to make them work. Right. Sometimes he leaves them out and you just get a nonsense sentence. So you know that he's looking at it. And so the easiest way to say that this happened is to say he consulted a King James Bible. It was there. He would open it up and The problem is everybody says it wasn't there. There's
Yeah.
no evidence that says it was there. So you have this really fascinating problem of saying, yep, he was reading from the page. I can see the evidence that he was reading from the page. And you have everybody who ever mentioned anything saying, nope, it wasn't there. So, how you deal with that one is an interesting historical question. Everybody's going to answer it a different way, but it is
Yeah.
not a simple answer.
No, because
Yeah,
it goes back into the type versus loose.
Yeah.
Were those the King James Bible passages that were appearing on the stone, or was it, the Holy Ghost bringing it to his remembrance and inspiration and him using King James Bible language?
I've got another book on translation called The Gift and Power of God,
I'll
translated.
have to read that one.
That'll tell you how I think it happened.
Yeah.
But I will say that is, again, my opinion, and I am not universally accepted as an authority on that. So, but I think there's an answer to it. But again, it's complex. There are no simple answers anywhere. And if somebody's giving you a simple answer, I'll take it on faith or take it without faith, but it isn't really understanding what's going on.
And what are your thoughts that Joseph perhaps knew the Bible really well and he was able to plagiarize or sort of quote it, recite it, but then add in his own changes?
Yeah, I just recently went through and looked at the places where Joseph is quoting the New Testament. Now, as soon as I say you quote the New Testament, you know that this is a translation issue or there's an issue of modern times, because there's simply no way that any language of the New Testament was available on the Nephite plates.
Yes, so that was another question I had.
Now, Nick
Frederick, it could be viewed as a textual anachronism.
Oh, yeah, same kind of thing. Nick Frederick is the guy who has done most of the work on Nicholas Frederick, has done most of the work on looking at the quotations in the New Testament. And I got this list of them from him, and then I went through to see what they were like. And it's really obvious to me that in a large number of cases, these are quotations from the New Testament, even when there are, in some cases, Old Testament passages that the New Testament is rephrasing, because it did that.
Yes, yeah.
It's the language of the New Testament, not the Old Testament, that's being used. So where do they come from? Well,
because that was one thing I noticed whenever I read through the New Testament, really studied particularly the epistles of Paul, and I began to notice that there was a lot of passages, in the writings of Paul that were very similar to, some of the verses in the Book of Mormon. The very obvious ones is like 1 Corinthians 13 and Moroni 7 about charity, which is nearly word for word. And like you said, that shouldn't have been on the gold plates. Yeah,
and I'll tell you, well, here's the best explanation I can give for where that language comes from. When I was at BYU, I was taking a class in Greek. Never did much with it, but I took an introductory class in Greek. And in one of the exercises, the professor put up on the board a passage. And, we had our textbooks and our dictionaries and stuff. He says, translate that one for me. And we started digging through the dictionary and all the words that we didn't know, which was most of them. And we found out that it was a passage out of the New Testament. And as he asked the class what the text was, 98% of us spit off the King James Version. This is what the translation was. And there were several places in there where the translation was a little bit inaccurate. It was off. It wasn't quite right. And, the one really bright woman in the class, of course, she got it right. But I was one of the ones that just said, yeah, this is the text. And I didn't notice any differences. As soon as I saw it was similar, boom, I went right to it because I was familiar with it and I knew that's what it was referring to. So I think in a lot of cases that happens. I think what happens with the New Testament passage is two things. One is because I believe that human beings cannot come up with very much in our head that we haven't seen before. If we were going to, the Holy Ghost says it can bring everything to our remembrance. You can't bring something to remembrance that you've never known in the first place. So I think a lot of these phrases Joseph had known and heard. So I think they were there. The way they are used, however, is really fascinating because they're used effortlessly. the image that I have and the way that I can best explain it, I listen to jazz, and in jazz, you'll have an artist who will be playing something and then they will quote something that everybody knows. There'll be a few bars, paragraphs, if you will, musical paragraphs, where they're quoting something else and the listener goes, oh yeah, I know that one. And then they take off, they're doing something, and then there's a quotation, and there's just this intricate interrelationship.
Yeah, it's kind of like interwoven.
Yeah, and artistically done. And in places where you don't need to, there are quotations from the New Testament where any other set of words could have worked. But they have to be quotations. And they're not quotations because Joseph's going through a text and saying, I'm going to read through First Peter right now, and I'm going to use this one, and then I'll use this set. They're all over the place. They're scattered. They're not even. It sort of jumps from here to there to back and forth. And you can tell by the nature of them that, this is something that is coming in the process of dictation. Obviously, because it's New Testament phrases, it's something that he's heard before. I would say that it's the inspiration of the divine behind it that is sort of triggering the connections to say, here's that phrase that you can put here. And then the question would be, why would you do that? And I think it had to do, frankly, with the reception audience that was primed for King James language, primed for things they understood. And when they would see those phrases in there, at least subconsciously, it would say, yes, this is familiar, this is scripture.
Because that's one of the purposes of the Book of Mormon, isn't it? To sort of testify and support the Bible.
Because we don't come up with these questions or thoughts about why that might be wrong until much later. You'd be 100 years later before you start getting people complaining about that part of the Book of Mormon.
Yeah.
When Campbell looks at the Book of Mormon, he doesn't complain about that. He complains about other things, but
doesn't he talk about that? He thinks the Book of Mormon addresses a lot like the 19th century Protestant Christianity sort of controversies of the time, things like infant baptism and things to do with salvation. Like, what are your thoughts on that? Like, some people might say that the Book of Mormon seems to resemble like a 19th century Protestant Christianity, and it doesn't have in it a lot of sort of like the later doctrines, such as like, kingdoms of glory or temple ceremonies or eternal marriage or becoming gods or like the pre-existence aren't really in there, or at least not explicitly in there.
Yeah, and we'll start with those first, because we tend to say, because where we live in our time period, we've got all those things. We say, oh yeah, those are doctrines, and some of them are beautiful and we love them. And we forget that they evolved over time, not evolved, but were revealed over time. Book of Mormon comes out in 1830. You're not getting some of those really cool doctrines until the Nauvoo period in the 1840s. So you've got them 10 years later. And in that first 10 years, nobody knew about those things.
Yeah.
They weren't part of Mormonism at all. So things that are, part and parcel to what we believe, they weren't there. So not really surprising that they weren't in the Book of Mormon, because they were revealed later. And it's really hard as an historian to look at Revelation and not understand that Revelation is tied to the context and the times and the peoples and the needs that they have. So, Revelation, as it should be, responds to conditions.
What would you think if somebody sort of had the thought of the Book of Mormon, is to contain the fullness of the gospel? And I guess the view I would have grown up with, viewing the Bible is, there's mistranslations and there's been plain and precious truths not in it. And that's maybe why, doctrines like the kingdoms of glory, with the knowledge of the plan of salvation, us being spirit children, of heavenly parents, there's a reason it's not in the Bible, but it should be in the Book of Mormon. And a skeptic might think, oh, the reason maybe it's not in the Book of Mormon, if Joseph was the author, is that he hadn't developed those theologies and they came later. What would be your thought to somebody who has that sort of view?
Well, some of what you said is based on the way we teach things that may or may not be, the way things actually developed or what the history would be. We always make up the stories so that we understand them better. And so the idea that, the Bible was missing these things and therefore we restored them, that's part of the concept of restoration. But again, develops over time.
Yeah.
What would I say about the things that, about Joseph Smith missing them? I'd say that's a question that should be asked. And one of the things that it comes from is the idea that we say that the Book of Mormon has the fullness of the gospel. Well, we say that, and then we say, oh, well, what is the gospel? Well, the gospel must be
Everything.
all these things.
All doctrine.
And that isn't what the Book of Mormon says. The Book of Mormon says the gospel is really pretty simple. Alma, the elder, forms a church as he leaves the court of Abinadi, or of King Noah, and as the Abinadi is on trial. So the only convert Abinadi makes is Alma. Alma goes off and he creates what he calls a church, which is a separation of a people that has a slightly different belief from everybody else that's the same culture. He takes that idea and he goes to Zarahemla. And he creates churches in Zarahemla. It's the first time we have churches. So Alma the Elder is really, really important in the development of this concept of a church, which is a separate organization inside of a larger community where there might be someone who believed differently. Well, when he creates the church, particularly when he gets to Zarahemla, he says, here's what your church is supposed to do. Preach nothing but faith and repentance. Well, what about this? What about that? What about all these other things? He says, nope, preach faith and repentance. You get to Christ defining his doctrine, and he talks about a few things. He talks about faith, repentance, baptism, and enduring to the end. That's my gospel, those 4 things. Why is that the fullness of the gospel? Because everything hangs on them. It's like when Christ was asked, what's the most important commandment? Love the Lord thy God. And the second one is like it, to love thy neighbor as thyself. And he says, everything else hangs on those. So it's not like there isn't anything else. It's not like we'll never have other revelation. It's that if you're going to dig down to the core and have the fullness of the gospel, it's faith, repentance, baptism, gift of the Holy Ghost, endure to the end.
Right.
Now, if we were talking theology, I would give you more of that, but we want to do historicity. So that's a different topic entirely. But
I think it comes down to how we interpret like what the fullness of the gospel means. It's not claiming that it contains the fullness of all doctrine and everything that's been revealed.
Does the Book of Mormon contain everything always everywhere? Of course not, it shouldn't. Now, let me go back to another point you made, which is, does it replicate all the controversies? One of the things that I notice as I'm going through the Book of Mormon is I notice that because of the doctrine of Christianity, or the doctrine of who Christ is and what his mission was, because that's revealed early in the Book of Mormon, we get Christian questions earlier than we do in the New Testament, because of course the New Testament waits for Christ. This information comes earlier in the Book of Mormon, but the same questions arise. The same questions that have to be answered in the New Testament have to be answered in the Book of Mormon. What is the relationship of baptism? If we have, what's the relation to remission of sin? How do you get remission of sin? How does that relate to the mission of Christ? That has to be answered. So a lot of these questions come up because these are Christian questions. These are questions that people have wrestled with. So it's not surprising that a Christian people will come up with those questions. That's part and parcel of what Christianity is about. Now, you do have the one about infant baptism, but it just so happened that the Spaniards, when they arrived in Mesoamerica, believed that the Native Americans had infant baptism. So this concept of infant baptism, or belief in something like an infant baptism, would have also been present in the world that Mormon lived in. And so if he's talking about that, it's not surprising, because the same issue could come up, because there was something very similar in the culture.
Right. So you don't think those things are necessary, Joseph, taking it from his 19th century sort of religious environment, but it could have been, in the ancient sort of historicity.
Yeah, it's not something that's unique. I mean, if you're going to say that there is an anachronism, you have to come up with a unique context to say, this could not have happened. Well, yeah, we know it did, in that point in time. There was something that looked like infant baptism. And of course, everything, it looked like infant baptism enough that that's exactly what the Spaniards called it when they saw the practice. So hardly surprising that we would see a reference to that kind of thing in the Book of Mormon. Can't be considered an anachronism because there was a plausible historical correlation.
Right. Okay. Whenever I read Grant Palmer's book, this sort of connecting to Protestant Christianity, he talked about like a lot of the phraseology and some of the sermons in the Book of Mormon, and phrasing like exhorting you and those sorts of things, and almost people having like born again experiences, being forgiven of their sins, remissions of their sins through faith in Jesus Christ, and paralleling similarities to like Methodist sort of conversion narratives and stories that Joseph might have heard from preachers and attending Methodist services, and that those made their way into the text of the Book of Mormon, and that seems like very much 19th century Protestant Christianity.
There's two different points there. One is the phrases, and the other is the story or the action.
Yeah.
So the phrase, it's the same way you get New Testament phrases in there. There are just phrases that become part of our vocabulary, and we just say things certain ways, and it depends on where we've learned our vocabulary. Joseph Smith was a Methodist exhorter at one point in time, so it's certain that he knew that language and that vocabulary. It's not surprising that it shows up at all. It would frankly be shocking if it did not. Now, that's the vocabulary. The next thing is the actions. You get people who are falling down under the Spirit, and of course, we get those kinds of things in certain evangelical kinds of contexts. The problem there is this is human. This is a human response. I remember early on in my days in anthropology, they showed a film of some tribe in Africa, and they showed the effect of the shaman when the spirit came upon the shaman, and they showed him shaking, and they showed, they had this film of what happens when the shaman was overcome by the gods or by the spirits. And then the next week, they showed a picture of an Ozark snake handler. And when he was overcome with the Holy Ghost, physically, it looked exactly the same. So here we've got
similar religious experiences.
It's a religious experience that gets expressed in the body in similar ways. And so it's a human experience. So it gets amplified by culture, but because it's a human experience, I can't say that it happened in the Book of Mormon that way, because again, it's a human experience. What is the context for that? Mark Wright, friend of mine, looked at a shamanic experience and the idea of the shaman coming back from the dead and communicating with the spirits. And he said, that's a good plausible context for what we see in the Book of Mormon. So again, because it's human experience and not only cultural, I don't see that as a problem in the Book of Mormon at all.
Okay. Some critics point to, the connection between Lehi's dream and Joseph Smith Sr.'s dream, and that whenever I, read them both, for the first time side by side, I was kind of floored by it, and they seem, the parallels are really similar. I think in Joseph Smith Sr.'s dream, there's, a tree with, white fruit and a rope and a mist of darkness and sort of like a great and spacious building. And some critics might seem like, or might view it as, Joseph Smith is just borrowing his own father's dream and putting that into the story. What is your take on that? How do you sort of reconcile that? Like, does it look like Joseph Smith is just retrofitting it into the Book of Mormon narrative?
Well, you remember back what I said about things were way more complex than we tend to see them. If you read that dream from Joseph's father and compare it, you immediately go, oh man, these things are really, really simple. And that's the surface level. They're similar, and it's Joseph's father. Now, more complex. We don't get the story from Joseph's father. We get it from Joseph's mother, and we get it, 50 years after the fact? So it's being
in her sort of like history or her biography.
it's in her biography. It's being written down later in life. She has lived with the Book of Mormon for about 50 years by the time it gets written down. So from the standpoint of an historian or a folklorist looking at that, what's getting affected? Now, what I could tell you, I think it is absolutely certain that there was some similar dream that Joseph's father had. Exactly what the elements were, I would not know. But when we get to the retelling by Lucy Mack, I think it's been influenced by the Book of Mormon. And so I think it looks similar because it's pulling from the Book of Mormon. And that has colored the way she recalled the previous one. And that's a known process in human history and folklore and the way people
in memory.
Memories. Yeah. So that's not surprising at all.
Right. So you're thinking it's not so much that maybe Joseph Smith Sr.'s dream influenced Lehi's dream in the Book of Mormon, but it could be that Lehi's dream in the Book of Mormon influenced Lucy's recollection of Joseph Smith Sr.'s dream decades after the fact.
Yeah. Although there had to be something to tie it together. So
some similarities.
A dream of a tree somewhere, but all of the details get elaborated. It's kind of the way where, in the early part of the Spalding manuscript idea, where they said, Spalding manuscript was behind the Book of Mormon, they would go to these people and they'd say, were they similar? Oh yeah, the names Nephi were in there. It was the same thing. Well, somehow they remembered it, but things got pushed together from multiple sources in their memory. When we found the thing, it didn't look at all like the Book of Mormon.
Right. Yeah,
so it was much better in their memory because of other things that were influencing memory. And that's what happens with...
It's not always the most reliable.
Yeah. We all do that. My wife is always telling me that I'm getting my stories wrong. I'll tell a story and she and I were much younger, and it's sort of like, oh no, it didn't happen that way. Well, it did in my mind.
Yeah. And Stephen Hubbard talked a lot about that when we had an interview on the first vision and how memory can change over time and interpreting memories and things. And another sort of question or criticism people might have of the Book of Mormon is maybe some of the prophecies in the Book of Mormon. And this is what I've sometimes thought about is, when it prophesies like Jesus being born of Mary, or Jesus being baptized by John the Baptist, or like the Charles Anton visit, and I can't read a sealed book, similar to the story of Martin Harris going to take the characters to Charles Anton, and that's some of I think it talks about Christopher Columbus as well, like discovering the Americas in First Nephi, and a skeptic who might think that if Joseph's the author, because it's a prophecy, if Nephi or Mormon wrote this, but those things happened before Joseph Smith, are those really prophecies if they happened, before Joseph's life? Just any thought on that?
Yeah, and again, things are more complex than normal, and it's a book in translation. Now, where does all that fit? Fulfilled prophecy can affect the way you translate something. So if you already know what the prophecy is telling you, then you rewrite the prophecy to fit what you already know. And one of the places that happens in the New Testament is the appropriation of Isaiah and the Emmanuel prophecy. So Isaiah prophesies that a young woman will have a son, and his name will be Emmanuel, and he'll be wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, in Hebrew in Isaiah, it's a young woman. In the Septuagint translated as a virgin. Well, the Septuagint was in Greek. And so when it's written in Greek, they borrow the Septuagint version. And so we have a virgin who is giving a birth to a child, and obviously Mary becomes the virgin. And so the scripture is there. Then the King James translators come along, and they're translating Isaiah. And when they translate Isaiah, it becomes a virgin. Well, the word isn't there. It's a young woman, but they translate it as virgin because of the New Testament, so fulfilled prophecy informs the way that they translated Isaiah. And I think that happens in the Book of Mormon, especially since Joseph was hardly a sophisticated translator. When he saw fulfilled prophecy, if he sees this woman who's giving birth to the Son of God, he knows who that is, and so he puts her name in. He gets to Isaiah 29.
They're quite specific.
Yeah, the translation is improved because he knows how it was translated. And again, when you look at translation, and how it's done and why, you realize it's this loose translation. It's not surprising at all. Now, one thing that I do have to say, because when I say loose translation, what a lot of people assume is that what Joseph is receiving is ideas, and he's putting ideas into words. And I think it's frequently much more controlled than that. There are times when it isn't. There are times when I see Joseph doing the translation, such as fulfilled prophecy. But I think more than ideas, he's given meaning. So he's not saying, "Oh, there's a Nephite guy who looks pretty good and has great big muscles like Freiberg painted him." He's not imagining that and telling a story. He's getting what the plates said, what the plates meant, and he's putting it in his words. But then at times, his words will trigger something. Oh, I know what that's about. And so that leads into these fulfilled prophecies.
And you talked about in your book about different types of translation. There's like the literal translation, then like conceptual translation, and there's a third one that escapes my memory, but it could be different types depending on the passage.
And I think that there are times every once in a while, and I'm sort of, again, there's controversy on this. I think that there were times when Joseph had sort of a prophetic inspired addition to a text. So we know for sure that happened in Genesis, where we get the book of Moses. We get the book of Moses because Joseph is translating the book of Genesis. And as part of that, he gets this inspiration and vision, and we get the book of Moses, which wasn't written down on any ancient text that we know of. This is a revelation. And I think every once in a while that same process shows up in the Book of Mormon, and I see it in the second half of Words of Mormon. I think that's a prophetic insertion into the text. So I think things are just way more complicated. And anytime we try to take a simple single answer and put a blanket over the top and said this one thing does everything, we're missing the complexities of the text and what it's really like. And if you think about what real life is, the way we do things is much more messy than a simple explanation can cover.
Right. Yeah. So you touched on earlier Deutero Isaiah, and maybe your response be similar to when we talked about New Testament passages, but if you have a very literal view of the translation as a tight translation, the Nephites wouldn't, according to scholars, believe that the later chapters of Isaiah, I think it was after chapter 40, would have been written after Lehi and his family left Jerusalem with the brass plates, so it wouldn't have been on the brass plates. Right. So according to this view, those passages shouldn't have been on the plates, and therefore shouldn't have been in the translation. And to some, that's almost like an anachronism, or like a smoking gun of this 19th century.
And that's probably the most difficult one. And if everybody had agreement, and we were absolutely certain that those parts of Deutero Isaiah were not there, if there was no controversy over that, then we would really be in trouble in the Book of Mormon, because the Book of Mormon uses it integrally. I got the word wrong. It's integral to the text.
Right. Yeah. Because I think I listened to David Bonkavoy, and he talked about one scripture from a Deutero Isaiah passage really being like a theme throughout the entire text of the Book of Mormon. I can't remember the one that it is. I think I can't even remember it, but I remember he talked about that. So it's kind of integral to the text of the Book of Mormon. Yeah,
it's added in. It's probably the one where
things like awake and arise and my son.
Oh yeah, there's a couple of them. Yeah, there's several of them that repeat more than once. And here's my opinion. And again, you have to remember this is my opinion, not necessarily held by very many people. I look at many of the things that they use to indicate that there's Deutero Isaiah is a later text, and I think they're correct. But I also know that what happens is there are scribal schools that make sure they pass the information on. And I think what happens in some cases is they also have fulfilled prophecy. So we get the name of Cyrus in there. Well, you wouldn't have Cyrus in a prophecy going forward. You only have it coming backward. And so then the idea that the name of Cyrus is there would be one of those things where you would say this has to be written later. It's the very same thing, I think, as seeing how tightly Isaiah 29 is tied to the Martin Harris Charles Anthony episode. I think it's fulfilled prophecy. So my hypothesis is that there really was an Isaiah text behind it, that those particular texts were transmitted and edited after the Babylonian experience because they saw that they fit it. And so they were, if you would, retrofit. And what we have from the old world tradition is that edited retrofit version of Isaiah. They would not have had that, but assuming that there was a pre-edited version, they would have had that one. And then when Joseph Smith translates, he isn't using a new translation. He's just taking what's there. And so he takes what we get in the language out of the King James Version.
Right.
So I think it's a combination of the way scribes worked on the text and how they preserved them, changes that ancient scribes would have made, and then the way we get that text in the Book of Mormon. I think that explains how it fits. Again, I'm a real outsider on that particular opinion, but I think that explains where everything is coming from.
But you don't believe that that Lehi and the Nephites would have had those things with them on the brass plates?
I think they would have had them on the brass plates, but prior to the time that they had been created with fulfilled prophecy in mind.
Right. Okay. Okay.
So,
okay.
If Isaiah wrote this text, somebody edited it and wrote this text. This one comes to the New World. When it gets translated, Joseph uses this text.
Okay. So the later sort of edited version. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. And of course, we know that process of editing goes on. It's just a question of how much goes on. There was enough that people see a different editor. But the reason there's controversy is because people also see thematic connections. So the reason why there is a problem with Isaiah and why there isn't any real single, completely single scholarly opinion is because there's good arguments for some continuity and there's good arguments for a separation. And again, where I see it is at some point in time, there was fulfilled prophecy and there was some rewriting done. That's the separation. The underlying thematic document would have been the same, and that's why you get the continuity of concept and theme. Okay.
And another element sort of related to like biblical scholarship is the story of the Jaredites, that they traveled, after the confounding of the languages at the Tower of Babel, and they traveled to the Americas, and they were the first civilization there. But according as my understanding to most biblical scholars, they believe that the Tower of Babel wasn't a literal historical event, but more like a ideological sort of origin myth, and that there were civilizations and languages before then. And if the Tower of Babel wasn't maybe a literal event or a myth, that calls into question, were there historically Jaredites, and calling into question the historicity of the Book of Mormon, which is kind of a big issue to some. What's sort of your take on that?
And again, it goes back to complexity. If you read it simplistically, and that's exactly what the text says, and then you go with the scholars who would say that it's a mythological event or a theological event, then of course you'd have to say there's a problem. But if you read it carefully, what the text says is that this is the information that we had, that Moroni is using. He's using a text that Mosiah used, and he's saying there was a lot of this stuff about the early history of the Bible that was in there, but I'm not going to repeat it. I'm going to skip it. So Moroni is summarizing, but he's summarizing what somebody else wrote, who obviously thought that it looked like the Bible and therefore connected it. So what did the actual text say? Well, we don't know. We're too far away from it. We're 2 translations away. So we don't have the original. We don't know what it was. We know enough to say that whatever it was, Mosiah thought that it looked like the Bible. And just like I said, with that verse I translated from Greek into King James English, if you see something that's similar, you make the connections. The Spanish conquistadores, well, not the conquistadores, they weren't interested in this stuff. The friars, the religious people who came in, they were the ones who saw connections between Christianity or Judaism, usually Christianity, in the natives, and wrote down their texts that way. So this is a very human process where we see something in a text, reinterpret it according to what we're expecting to see. And then by the time you get to Moroni, he's a version away. So of course, he just gives the simple explanation and goes. So I think the fact that it says it there is a result of somebody else's translation. We do not know what the original was. It would not be surprising if they came from a land where there were ziggurats, but not necessarily this confusion, and that's part of that historical translation. And again, we see that kind of process happening in texts all along.
Right. So you don't think it necessarily has to call into question the historicity of the Book of Mormon?
No, I think it came from the same source that the Bible came from. And that story would have been on the brass plates. It certainly would have been there. That's right. Part of this, this early part. That was all part of the text that was available prior to 600 BC.
Right. You talk about this a little bit in your book, but some people are maybe disturbed by passages that seem a little bit racist in the Book of Mormon, or maybe not a little bit, that just seem racist. The Lamanites being cursed with the dark skin. And some people point to that maybe coming from Joseph Smith's sort of 19th century environment with the mound builder myth, and people seeing these mounds but believing that there must have been a superior white race that built them, that these savage Native Americans weren't sort of civilized enough. And the view of the Hebrews also talks about like 2 sort of like civilizations, and sort of like I think it talks about like a white race and a dark race, and some people would feel disturbed that there's racism in the Book of Mormon, whether it's coming from God or if it's coming from Joseph Smith or Nephi, perhaps, as a possibility. What's your take on the racism and God cursing the Lamanites with a dark skin?
As with everything else, it's complex. The idea that there was racism that was read into the book and that people who read the book got racism out of it, I think that's absolutely true. I think that there was a lot of the racism among early Latter-day Saints, some of it against people with black skin. Oddly enough, right at the beginning, very little against people that would have been called red skin or Native Americans. But there are some other sort of racist white superiority things that happened with the Latter-day Saints in their later interactions with Native Americans. But going back to the text, the problem in the text is if you don't read backwards, if you don't start with our cultural problems and push them back onto the text, and you read the text and try to see how is the text using this language, you learn 2 things. First is the Nephites were absolutely prejudiced. Absolutely. It had nothing to do with skin color. It had to do with the fact that anybody who is not us is a bad guy. And so it's the us versus them prejudice, which frankly is so human that it's existed in pretty much every culture we've ever seen. It's always us versus them. And people always speak pejoratively of the other, somebody who's not like us. And what happens in the Book of Mormon is the Lamanites are, because of the separation, and frankly, I think because of how, that they were brothers, that they came from the same place, you had to make a very drastic division so that people would see them as separate. Now, what happens is the language uses dark skin. And of course, we take our concept of dark skin and the fact that we have inherited prejudicial language that's around skin color, and we push it back onto the Book of Mormon and we read it into the Book of Mormon and say, aha, they say they're cursed with the dark skin. Therefore, that means that they must have been prejudiced the same way we are. But it's not true. You read through those passages and you never see anybody discriminated on skin color. You never see anyone distinguished by skin color. And the one occasion in the book, well, for two things. One, if you look at the language, it's always metaphorical. What's wrong with the Lamanites is they're cursed because they're separated from God, not because of skin color. That's a mark, however you want to deal with that. But conceptually, every time it talks about dark, it's always black and white is good. It isn't skin color because when Christ is praying, he's talking to his Nephite apostles who are presumably the same color as everybody else. And then he says, they became white while they were praying. Well, wait a minute. I thought they were white already. If you're a Nephite, you're white. How do you become white when you're praying?
Unless they're glowing white like an angel, but
yeah, but again, that's this other image, and we don't follow it through because we take the quick route of our assumptions and put them onto the text. The place where I think it really makes a big difference is you get a story where Captain Moroni needs to exchange some captives and he can't do it. And so he's going to use trickery to convince, to let the Lamanites, let them in so that they can take their captives. And so what he does is he says, I have to look through everybody I've got and I have to find a Lamanite. So he's got a Nephite army. He says, I need to find a Lamanite. He finds one who had come from the land of Nephi. So here's a Lamanite. If there was a difference between white and black, he wouldn't have had to search too far. If you say, I have a picture of a friend of mine who served a mission in Africa, and there's this big crowd of Africans and one or two white heads in there. And it's sort of like, yep, those are the missionaries. Well, if you reverse that, it's pretty easy to find the black guy among all the white guys, right? But that wasn't what he said. He said, I had to go look for them. And then he says, well, you're going to be the one who's going to go to the Lamanites and you're going to give them all of this wine so they can get drunk. And he picks 6 Nephites to go with him. Well, if you got one black guy and 6 white guys coming up to a black guy, they might notice that there's 6 guys that don't look like him. So it's not visual. In order for the visual deception to work, they all have to look similar. Right. So there can't be a skin color difference. So when it says a dark skin, it cannot mean that. And we have an evidence of the action in the Book of Mormon where we cannot see the difference in skin color. Then it goes back to, well, why did you need a language, most likely?
Right.
Language or accent or something like that.
So you don't think it's literal? Like the skin was literally cursed, but it means something else?
They were cursed, and the imagery is that it is on the skin. The ancient world often believed that the internal would display on the external. And so the idea of having the external witness something, you get it even in the Bible. Job will say, my face was black because of problems. Well, his face didn't turn black. He didn't go to the mirror and say, oh man, all of a sudden I look like a different person. No, his face was black because of the imagery that was being used.
It's almost similar to if somebody leaves the church, some members can say what they've got a dark countenance in them.
Yeah, exactly. That kind of thing. This guy is evil. I can feel it. He has a dark countenance. Well, you're not talking about skin color. There's nothing about that. You're talking about a moral judgment or a spiritual judgment that you're making on them. And if you think about it, this happens again so often in the Book of Mormon. How do you become a Nephite and become white? All you have to do is say, I believe in Jesus Christ. I believe the Nephite religion. Can you imagine what it would be like if somebody were an African and they said, I happen to believe in the gospel, and they woke up the next morning and they look like a Swede? It doesn't happen. There's just
Yeah.
no human way that this occurs. But again, when you look at what actually happens in the Book of Mormon, it's used metaphorically, and we have incidences that tell us it cannot be skinned. So that tells us that we're using our prejudices and our understanding of language to push it back on the text rather than what the text actually says.
But did Joseph Smith and fellow presidents of the church, did they interpret it that way? Like I know I've read quotes from Spencer W. Kimball about the Native Americans, being descendants of the Lamanites, and literally as they are accepting the gospel, that their skin will turn more white.
Yeah. Oh yeah, they absolutely believed it. And again, it's because you read it simply. You read it and you say, oh, this is scripture, therefore that's what it is. Anytime you take the simple way, you're going to interpret it simply. And they did. And one of the reasons was that it fit with some of the prejudices that they'd grown up with.
And what do you think of of like Dan Vogel's viewer theory that this just came out of the 19th century sort of environment or worldview, like the mound builder myth, this racism, that it just stemmed from that, and that's sort of the source for this idea of Nephites and Lamanites? And
I think that's a better explanation for why people read it that way than it is for the way it's written. I absolutely believe that all of that mythology affected the way people read the book when they read it.
Mm-hmm.
But how you read a book and what the book actually says are two different things. Right.
We'll briefly talk about DNA. I'm sorry this is going on longer. I appreciate the time that you're giving to me, but you did talk about this in your book, and we believed Joseph Smith up until I think Gordon B. Hinckley that the principal ancestors of the Native Americans were the Lamanites, and that that they descend from the Lamanites, and that we know that Lehi and his family came from Israel, but according to sort of DNA testing, that I think it's like 99.6% of Native Americans that have been tested, their DNA descends from Asia, I think Siberia, Mongolia, and not from Israel. And some critics would say, well, doesn't this sort of disprove the historicity of the Book of Mormon, and or at least the assumption or the belief that they populated the entire continent of the Americas? But what's sort of like your take on sort of like DNA and the lack of DNA to support Native Americans coming from Israel?
Well, we'll start with the most important one, which is the one you mentioned, which is, I think it absolutely incontrovertibly says that the Book of Mormon did not populate the entire Western Hemisphere. There's so many reasons for that I'm hardly surprised at that information. There's no way that I would think that that's discouraging for the Book of Mormon at all, because you can come to that conclusion without DNA. It just doesn't, and it's something that I think just finally puts to rest that misconception that Latter-day Saints have had about the Book of Mormon. We have to understand
it. Like there's scientific proof that there are people, civilizations here before.
There's just so much there that this is finally one where they can say, yeah, I don't have to worry about that anymore. Now, the other problem, of course, with DNA is that DNA gets used because we know that this is unique, and therefore it proves so many things. And again, simplicity comes in. It says, well, this is what the DNA show. And we think because of because of where we get our information, which is television, we believe in crime shows where they say, we have the DNA, and therefore we point to it. And we don't realize that what DNA does when you're dealing with, I'm comparing an individual to another individual, is not the same as saying I'm comparing this to genetic migrations of people. It's a different kind of concept. And part of it's because what you're dealing with is this large amount of DNA rather than a specific individual. Now, why does that make a difference? And I'm not a DNA expert by any means, but the people I'm getting the information from are scientists who actually specialize in this. And there are so many reasons why, once we understand the Book of Mormon as a smaller population, why their genetic material does not survive. So if you count the people who came over with Lehi and who would have come from that area, you end up with, even if you add in extra bodies that we don't know about, you get maybe 30 people. Well, I said earlier that there were 6,000 people in the foothills. There's people all over the place. You get 30 people and you start mixing their genetic material with everybody else. Whose is going to survive? Again, there's lots of reasons why genetic material will or will not survive. You get two siblings in the same family and they get their genetic history back, and it's not exactly the same. Well, they have the same parents. Why isn't it exactly the same? Well, it's because of specifics in your genetics and what happens to show up. There was a study done, and for some reason, I think it was Iceland or Greenland, and they were talking about information they have. And I think there were originally, and I'm bad at remembering numbers, so 300 or 600, whatever it is. Let's say there were 600 original settlers, and they know who they were, and they can, they know what the genetic material was. They can only trace 300 of them to the original settlers. Half of the original genetic material is gone. And this is a much more recent example and very controlled. So when we're dealing with DNA, we're dealing with what survives. And if you look at the Book of Mormon, as we must, as a much smaller population that mixes in with the people that were already there, it's hardly shocking at all that their specific genetic markers that would have come from Israel would survive. That's if we even knew exactly what those genetic markers were so that we could look for them. Now, as a side note, for those who might know, there was at one point in time a study done that seemed to indicate that there was a certain Hebrew haplotype that showed up in North America. And this was touted as DNA evidence that there was a connection between the Book of Mormon.
Is this from Rod Meldrum?
Yes.
Yeah.
That has since been changed and the science is different. And even the person who wrote the original article says it's wrong. They found it's totally different. And there is no connection. So, if anybody is saying, but there is genetic proof, that is not correct. Better science has indicated that it is not.
Right. Okay. And I noted a couple of things because some critics would say that I think there's scripture in Ether where it talks about like how the Jaredites went, traveled to a place, went to a quarter where never man dwelt.
Yeah.
There's scripture in 2 Nephi 1 where it says Nephi was brought to a land sort of kept from other nations. And some people might read the text kind of face value or literally, and that it's inconsistent with there being other nations and civilizations before then. Certainly the way I would have read it growing up is that the Jaredites and the Nephites and the Lamanites, these are the ones who populated the continent, and there weren't other nations or civilizations.
And a lot of it, and particularly the one in Ether, that's used a lot because it says there's nobody there.
Yeah.
But we don't actually read it because that's before they were left to come to the New World. That's an old world statement. It has nothing to do with the New World. So that statement of where they traveled and nobody was there, that's before they ever came to the Americas. So we kind of misuse that scripture. And, keeping something from other nations, that's kind of the whole promise of the Book of Mormon anyway. You'll be safe and protected from other nations. We assume that means, other continents, but if there's other people there, he's saying, you're going to be safe from the other kings and cities and people who are around. So again, we will either misread the text or we will impose upon it something that we think it should say, whether it says that or not.
Okay. Well, I think I've asked you a lot of the tough questions I wanted. There's probably so many more I could, but to respect your time, I think I've really appreciated your willingness to engage and to answer some of the tough questions and share sort of your thoughts and perspectives. I thought in closing, that might just be nice for you to share just your overall view on, like, do you think Joe Smith, could he have had the capability to produce the Book of Mormon? Just finish off with just sharing your final thoughts on what you find most just compelling or more spiritually powerful or beautiful about the text of the Book of Mormon, and maybe any advice to people who maybe have questions or doubts or struggling with things to do with the historicity of the Book of Mormon.
I am now approaching about 40 years worth of intensive study on the Book of Mormon. And I've looked at it as deeply as I can look at it. And I started looking at historical things. And obviously there's, that book that deals with history. But since that time, I've started even looking at the text and how the text was constructed. Everywhere I go, there is more depth to the Book of Mormon than I ever expected. There are more things in the Book of Mormon that do not behave the way I would expect them to behave. And every once in a while, those things are hidden because Orson Pratt changed the way the chapters worked in 1879. And when you go back to the original chapters, the logic behind those chapters all of a sudden has a logic to it, but it is the one we understand. There is so much both in the history and in the way the text is constructed, where I can look at things and I can say, on the level of the translation, here's where I see Joseph involved. So when people say there are elements from the 19th century, yeah, I agree with that. There are some, but they're part of the translation layer. They're part of English. They're part of Joseph's language. They're part of this issue of translation. Then you kind of dive down deeper and you go, yeah, these are things Joseph could not have known. And it has nothing to do with history. There's no way you could have known the correlation between the timing of Teotihuacan's conquest of the Maya and the end of the Nephites. There's no way you could have known that because we didn't know that until 40 or 50 years ago. If no, it's more recent than that, actually, I think. But there's places where the history he couldn't have known that, and it works. But there's places in the text with the way the text is constructed that are constructed in ways that don't make any sense. One of them, for example, my friend Mark Wright first discovered this, and I did the research to kind of hone down and find out. But when you look at the original chapters, when Mormon is writing, one of the big markers to end a text is when it says amen. And if there's a testifying amen, boy, that'll end a chapter. And if the story isn't over, the story starts at the next chapter. Orson fixed a couple of those because he knew they didn't work right. But when he doesn't have any other reason for doing it, he will end on a 5-year marker, some multiple of 5 years. Why would he do that? And you look through it, and if he doesn't have any other reason to end the text, it's going to end with one of these 5-year markers. And it's pretty consistent, and there's just no logic to it. Unless you look back to the Mesoamerican culture, among the Maya, they would erect a stela every 5 years to commemorate the previous 5 years worth of history. So in Mormon's mind, it appears that there is a Mesoamerican logic to a 5-year period of saying this is the history in that 5-year period. So every time I dig into the Book of Mormon, there's more depth there than I'd ever imagined, and it keeps working. So I said early, you have patience. If you have questions about the Book of Mormon, what do you do about them? You keep reading, you keep learning, because it keeps getting better. We have more and more people explaining more and more things, and we understand better than we ever have before, which gives me hope that it's going to get better. So yeah, the answer to questions is learn. And I would suggest you don't learn everything from the internet, because there's often some really weird stuff out there where again, they don't deal with the complexities. They'll deal with the soundbite issues. But yeah, keep learning.
Yeah. And would you say you find the naturalistic explanations or theories of the Book of Mormon, there's been some like, Ethan Smith or Solomon Spaulding, but then maybe the more sophisticated ones is that Joseph Smith was just taking in all these things from his environment. He was telling stories to his family, and he was just able to dictate this long, intricate text with, sermons and,
Yeah.
quoting from the King James Bible. I'm guessing you're unpersuaded by those naturalistic explanations for Joseph being able to dictate this text himself from everything in his environment and milieu.
If Joseph Smith had done that, first of all, the Spaulding manuscript, any of these other things that he would have copied, none of those work at all. There's just no connections.
Yeah.
The idea that he would write it as absorbing all of these things from his environment and then writing it, that would have made him an excellent genius author.
Yes.
And so that's a possibility. Except he would have missed the history. He would have written history according to what he understood, and not have a history that gets better with time with the more we discover. All of the things that I've mentioned that where the history matches up with the Book of Mormon weren't even available to Joseph Smith in 1830. The world did not know those things. Those are all things that we've learned since then. And the more we learn, the better it gets. I remember at one point in time, we had a Latter-day Saint author think that Teotihuacan must have been the place where the righteous converted Lamanites, the anti-Nephi Lehites went, and they were pacifists. Well, all of a sudden we find out that really wasn't true. But the text of the Book of Mormon fits better than what that guess was. So yeah, if Joseph Smith were creating a novel the way anybody else creates a novel, I would say that could be an explanation for the Book of Mormon. But you can't use that explanation when you say, how about the details? Why does it fit? Why do things happen the way they do? Because those are all foreign. All of the ways that years are used in the Book of Mormon, like I just mentioned, the ending of the text on 5-year periods, there's no way he's going to come up with that. There's nothing in his environment that would have established using amen as an absolute ending to a text, even when it wasn't supposed to end. So there's just too much depth in the text to make that work. So yeah, no, I can't see him making it up. I see too many things in the text. A couple of them that if I were to try and explain them, we'd be going another hour, which we don't want to do.
And your view of sort of the translation and more of maybe of a looser model incorporates or helps to navigate through maybe the 19th century or anachronistic elements, but also accounts for things that you see as like ancient origin or historical things or things that seem beyond Joseph Smith's capabilities.
Yeah, I think when you deal with language, with the level of language on the English text level, we can see influence of the 19th century, and going back to what Royal Skousen said, a cultural translation.
Yeah.
But then when you get to the content and the actions of the text, the flow of events, those fit too well with known history. And because that history has only been known since the creation of the Book of Mormon, there's no way that his imagination would have been justified. If it were imagination, it should have been completely debunked by now. Archaeology should have torn that thing to shreds. I mean, not too long ago, we had this fascinating hoax of, I think it was Hitler's papers or something that was found. And then they very quickly found out that, this was a forgery because things didn't match correctly.
Yeah, fraud should be more apparent over time.
Yeah. the longer you go, and these days we can find things that are wrong pretty fast, but not in the Book of Mormon. It's still standing after 200 years of intense work and all kinds of attempts to try to show that it isn't correct. But the more we find out about archaeology, the more we know about history, the more we understand how that text was put together. All of those things just supersede Joseph entirely, even in our best imagination of what he might have done. It's far beyond him.
Yeah. And one last question, and this is maybe one that I've heard, a critic say, and this is me just putting on my skeptical hat for a minute, is some critics have said that the loose sort of model or translation theory, that it sort of accounts for errors or anachronisms, and it's almost indistinguishable from an inspired revelation, and Joseph Smith made it up. And they would say is, it's just a way to sort of wiggle room for errors or anachronism, 19th century things that in other texts would prove it's not an ancient origin. Could you just give a brief response to that? I think you've already sort of shared because of the historical elements.
Yeah, there's just there are too many layers that we can peel back on the text, where we can look at this aspect and then look at this aspect and look at this aspect. And no matter what we do, to pretty much any way we look at it, other than the thin layer of translation, once we get past the English words and we start dealing with what the text actually does, the way it's constructed, the imageries that it uses, the way it fits in with history, the more we peel those things back, the better the text looks. And frankly, the less possibility there is that anybody in Joseph's times could have created that. So even if somebody said, yeah, there was a book he was reading from, nobody knows how that book could have been created. It just couldn't have been.
Yeah.
The only book that would have been able to be the source for Joseph Smith is the Golden Plates. It's the only way you could do it.
Okay. Brant Gardner, thank you so much for giving me your time and for this great interview. I feel like I could talk to you all day, and it's been a great discussion. I'll point listeners as well to this book, The Book of Mormon is History. And what was the name of the other book about translation?
There's a book on translation called The Gift and Power.
I'll link those as well.
It's also by Koford Books. Looks kind of similar to that one. There's a 6-volume set of commentary on the Book of Mormon called Second Witness. There's a book called Labor Diligently to Write. And for that one's free, which is, nice price.
Oh, yeah.
It's volume 35 of the Interpreter Journal. So if you go to the Interpreter Journal, look up volume 35, that whole volume is this book called Labor Diligently to Write, where I'm looking at how Nephi and Mormon wrote things.
Well, thank you, Brant Gardner, so much for coming on. Listeners who are watching this, please, if you've enjoyed this, like, share, and subscribe to my channel, Mormonism with the Murph. And I'm going to continue to bring on, experts and scholars and have discussions discussing the church's truth claims and things in church history. So please subscribe if you haven't. Share this with people who might enjoy it. And I'll see you next time on Mormonism with the Murph. Take care. Thanks, Brant.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for watching this video. If you've enjoyed it, please give it a thumbs up, like, share, comment, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any future content. You can listen to my episodes on podcast form on Anchor or Spotify, and you can also follow me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. If you care to donate, you can via my PayPal or Patreon. Thanks for joining Mormonism with the Murph. Take care. Bye-bye.